The cell was cold, the air laced with the sharp tang of iron and mildew. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a pallid, sickly light over the rough-hewn walls. It was never fully dark in here, not in the way Luke remembered darkness from the days before. The bulb buzzed faintly, a reminder that even small mercies like silence were luxuries long gone. Luke sat cross-legged on his cot, his back pressed against the damp stone wall. He stared at the faded tattoo on his wrist, 1461. The numbers didn't feel like his. They felt like chains etched into his skin. He traced them with a finger as if trying to scrape them away. He used to be someone, once, a boy who dreamed of playing soccer, of going to university, of someday building a life worth living. But those memories were distant now, like pictures crumpled and shoved into the back of a drawer. A soft sound pulled his attention, Jake shifting on his cot across the room. His best friend had always been restless, even in the days before, but here the movement felt almost defiant, a refusal to sit still while the world crushed them. "You ever think about it?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible. Luke glanced over. "Think about what?" "Who we were, who we are. Doesn't it mess with your head?" Jake's green eyes caught the dim light, his expression raw, unguarded. Luke hesitated, his fingers tightening on his wrist. All the time. The admission surprised him, as if the words had been dragged out against his will. Jake gave him a knowing look, the faintest shadow of a grin. "I knew it," Jake said. "You've got that face." Luke frowned. "What face?" "The one that screams, 'I'm planning something.'" "I'm not planning anything," Luke lied, turning away. He studied the cell instead. 6 men shared the space, each one marked by their assigned numbers, and the same hollow-eyed expression of the broken. The walls were bare stone, cold and rough under their hands. The single bulb above flickered now and then, like it might die any second, though it never did. The heavy clang of the door interrupted them, the sound ricocheting off the walls. A ripple of tension spread through the room as a vampire guard stepped inside. Tall, skeletal, his pale skin gleaming under the sickly light, he moved with an inhuman grace that made Luke's stomach turn. "Line up," the guard commanded, his voice sharp and clipped. The men scrambled into position, their chains clinking softly. Luke stood beside Jake, heart pounding as the vampire's crimson gaze swept over them. He knew better than to meet those eyes directly. Even now, it felt like a death sentence waiting to happen. 1461. 1482, the guard said, pointing at Luke and Jake. "East wing. Move!" Luke swallowed hard as he stepped forward. The east wing was a labyrinth, its walls decorated with grotesque paintings and tapestries that seemed to writhe under the torchlight. He'd been there before, hauling supplies or scrubbing floors until his hands bled. This time, as the guard led them through the winding halls, Luke tried to absorb every detail: the tapestries, the locked doors, the patterns on the floor. His mind mapped each twist and turn, clinging to the hope that someday this knowledge might save them. As they passed one of the side rooms, Luke caught a glimpse of the grotesque power dynamics that ruled the mansion. A vampire sat in a high-backed crimson chair, his pale fingers combing lazily through the hair of a young woman kneeling at his feet. She was wearing an intricate black dress, more decoration than clothing, her head bowed, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Luke forced himself to look away, but Jake didn't. "She doesn't even flinch," Jake muttered under his breath, his voice low but filled with something Luke couldn't quite name: anger, maybe pity. "Keep moving!" the guard snapped, his voice like a whip. But Jake didn't move right away. His steps slowed, his eyes lingering on the woman. Luke nudged him sharply, and Jake blinked, shaking himself out of whatever trance had gripped him. They hurried to catch up to the guard, who gave them a warning glance but said nothing more. "She looked dead inside," Jake said after a moment, his voice hollow. "They all do," Luke replied. His tone was flat, mechanical. He didn't dare let the words carry weight. Not here. But Jake fell silent, his jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. They turned another corner, and the corridor opened into a vast hall lit by flickering torches. The east wing loomed ahead, its doors carved with images of fanged beasts devouring prey. For all its grandeur, it was a mausoleum, a monument to the living dead. Jake leaned close to Luke, his voice a whisper, barely audible. "One day, we'll get out of here." Luke didn't reply. He didn't want to crush Jake's fragile hope, but he couldn't feed it either. Not yet. The West Wing was a world apart from the cold, damp cells where they slept. The halls stretched endlessly, filled with long, gleaming tables set beneath chandeliers dripping with crystals. Golden sconces cast warm light onto polished marble floors, and the air smelled of roasted meat, spiced wine, and something metallic Luke couldn't name but knew all too well. This was where the vampires dined. Luke and Jake stood at the edge of the room with the other slaves, heads bowed, waiting for the first command. 100 eyes swirled with predatory hunger. Luke kept his own gaze fixed on the floor, every muscle coiled tight as the vampires entered, their silken clothes brushing against the stone like whispers of death. Jake leaned in close, his voice barely a breath. "They eat like kings." Luke nudged him sharply with his elbow, not daring to respond. The vampires moved languidly, their steps graceful, predatory. They took their seats at the tables while the human slaves scurried forward, carrying ornate platters of food. Roast meats glistened under the chandeliers, surrounded by vegetables arranged like art. The vampires did eat human food, but it wasn't why they were here. At the far end of the room, a group of pets entered. They were adorned in silks and chains, their skin pale and marked by faint scars or fresh bites. Each one belonged to a vampire, their lives bound in submission and servitude. Luke couldn't help but glance at Jake, whose jaw tightened as his eyes lingered on a young woman with long auburn hair. She looked no older than 20, her wrists bound by delicate golden cuffs as she walked behind her master. "She shouldn't be here," Jake muttered, his voice dark. "She doesn't have a choice," Luke replied coldly. "Neither do we." The feast began. Luke's duties that evening were simple: keep the tables clear, refill goblets, and avoid attracting attention. The vampires drank deep from their chalices, their laughter echoing like the sound of cracking glass. It wasn't long before the real feast began. The first vampire, a gaunt man with silver-streaked hair, grabbed his pet by the wrist and pulled her into his lap. The room grew quieter, the air thick with anticipation. His lips brushed the girl's neck, and then his fangs sank deep into her flesh. Her muffled gasp was lost beneath the sound of goblets clinking and forks scraping plates. One by one, the vampires followed suit. Pets were pulled from their places, their bodies trembling as their masters fed. Some tried to hide their fear, others embraced their role with eerie obedience. The sight turned Luke's stomach, but he didn't let it show. Jake, however, was different. He wasn't just disgusted, he was enraged. "She's just a girl," Jake hissed under his breath, his fists clenched at his sides. "Keep your mouth shut," Luke whispered sharply, grabbing Jake's arm. Jake shook him off, his green eyes blazing. It was a mistake. The female vampire nearest them turned her head, her crimson gaze locking onto Jake. She was strikingly beautiful, with pale, flawless skin and hair as black as a raven's wing. Her lips curled into a predatory smile, revealing fangs slick with blood. "Speak up, little slave," she purred. "You seem upset." Jake stiffened, his jaw set, but he didn't answer. The vampire rose from her seat, her movements languid but dangerous. She towered over Jake, her presence suffocating. "When I ask a question, you answer." Luke's breath caught in his throat as the vampire's hand shot out, striking Jake hard across the face. He staggered but didn't fall, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You dared to defy me?" she said, her voice like silk over a blade. Luke clenched his fists, rage boiling inside him, but he forced himself to stay still. Acting out would only make things worse, for both of them. The vampire grabbed Jake by the collar, dragging him toward the exit. "I'll teach you what happens when slaves forget their place." Jake didn't struggle. He cast a single glance at Luke before disappearing through the doorway. The rest of the meal passed in a blur. Luke moved mechanically, clearing plates, refilling goblets, and avoiding the eyes of the vampires. but inside his mind churned with rage. The image of Jake being dragged away burned in his memory. He wanted to rip that vampire apart, to tear her fangs from her mouth and make her bleed the way she made Jake bleed. But he couldn't. Not yet. When the meal finally ended, Luke's duties shifted to escorting the pets back to their quarters. The vampires retreated to their private chambers, sated for the moment, leaving the room heavy with the scent of blood and fear. Luke led the pets down a dim corridor, their chains clinking softly. Some walked with their heads high, their expressions blank, while others stumbled, their legs weak from blood loss. He couldn't help but glance at the auburn-haired girl Jake had noticed earlier. She was quieter than the others, her eyes downcast but alert. "You'll be fine," Luke murmured to her, his voice low enough that the guards wouldn't hear. She didn't respond, but her fingers tightened briefly on the chain she held. It was a small gesture, but it gave Luke a flicker of hope. Luke led the line of pets down the dim corridor toward their quarters, the iron shackles on their wrists jingling softly with each step. The air was heavy, thick with the metallic scent of blood and the quiet murmurs of the pets, who moved like ghosts in the flickering torchlight. Their quarters were small but opulent compared to the slaves' cells. Velvet-lined beds, ornate mirrors, and faintly glowing chandeliers spoke to the vampires' desire to keep their prized possessions presentable. But the luxury was a farce. Every corner of the room reeked of control. The slaves lined up along the far wall as one of the guards barked orders. "Tend to them! Make it quick!" No unnecessary contact. Iron tablets were distributed first, handed out in small tin cups of water. Luke moved methodically, offering the bitter tablets to the pets, who gulped them down without a word. Their hands trembled as they drank, some leaving faint smudges of blood on the rims. He didn't speak to them. The guard's eyes were everywhere, sharp and unyielding. "Strip them," the guard growled. Luke hesitated, but the others didn't. With practiced efficiency, they began removing the pet's delicate clothing, revealing pale, bruised skin marred by fresh bite marks. Some pets stood numbly, their eyes glazed, while others flinched at every movement. He worked quickly, untying the silken ribbons of one pet's dress and letting it fall to the floor. Her body was as thin as paper, her ribs stark against her skin. Luke's jaw tightened, but he didn't linger. Guards stood at every corner of the room, their eyes like razors, watching for any movement that might hint at improper touch or empathy. One guard smirked, his hand resting on the hilt of his whip as if daring one of them to make a mistake. Buckets of warm water were brought in next, along with rough cloths. "Luke," oaked one in the water, wringing it out before beginning to clean the pets. He avoided their eyes, focusing on the task at hand. He didn't speak, didn't linger, just wiped away the blood and grime as gently as he could without drawing attention. The auburn-haired girl from earlier flinched when he touched her shoulder, her eyes flicking up to his for the briefest second. He gave the slightest shake of his head, a silent reassurance that he meant no harm. She said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. When the task was done, the pets were led to their beds. Some collapsed immediately, curling into fetal positions as if trying to hide from the world. Others sat stiffly, their eyes unfocused, waiting for the next command. Luke and the other slaves were dismissed shortly after, escorted back to their own quarters under the ever-watchful eyes of the guards. Luke had barely sat down on his cot when the cell door opened again, and Jake was shoved inside. He stumbled forward, collapsing to his knees with a strangled groan. His shirt was in tatters, barely clinging to his bloodied back. Crimson streaks ran down his arms and legs, his face swollen and bruised almost beyond recognition. "Sit him up," the guard barked at Luke. Luke hurried to Jake's side, lifting him under the arms and dragging him to his cot. Jake hissed in pain, his teeth gritted but didn't fight. From the doorway, a second guard carried a bucket of salt water and threw it over Jake without warning. Psh! Jake screamed, the sound raw and animalistic as the salt seeped into the open wounds across his back. His body convulsed, his hands clawing at the cot as if trying to dig into the stone beneath. Luke's hands clenched into fists, the urge to lash out boiling in his veins, but he forced himself to stay still. He couldn't do anything, not now, not yet. The guard sneered. "Be grateful. Keeps the infection away. If you're lucky, you'll live to see tomorrow." The door slammed shut behind them, leaving the room in silence save for Jake's ragged breathing. Luke knelt beside him, grabbing the thin blanket from his cot and draping it carefully over Jake's trembling frame. "Jake," he said quietly. Jake didn't respond, his face buried in the crook of his arm. "We'll get out of here," Luke whispered, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I swear to you, we'll get out, and they'll pay for this." Jake let out a weak, bitter laugh, his breath hitching as he fought back tears. Luke sat back on his cot, staring at the tattoo on his wrist, 1461. It felt heavier than ever, like it was pressing into his very soul. The light bulb above flickered faintly, casting long, wavering shadows across the cell. Shadows that felt alive, twisting and stretching, whispering promises of vengeance in the quiet darkness. Luke stared at the damp stone ceiling of their cell, the muffled sounds of the mansion's nightly activities filtering through the walls. Jake lay on his cot across the room, his back wrapped in bandages that were already stained dark red. His breathing was shallow, each exhale carrying a faint hiss of pain. "You should rest," Luke muttered, breaking the heavy silence. Jake chuckled bitterly, the sound rasping in his throat. "What's the point? Can't rest when every breath feels like fire?" Luke sighed and sat up, his hands clasped loosely between his knees. He'd seen slaves beaten before, but seeing Jake dragged back, barely conscious and whipped like an animal, had lit a fire in him that he couldn't extinguish. "She'd do it again, you know," Luke said quietly, his voice barely audible over the drip of water from the corner. Jake turned his head, his green eyes flashing in the dim light. "Not if we're gone." Luke froze, the words hanging in the air like a blade poised to fall. "Gone?" Jake propped himself up on one elbow, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounds. "Yeah, gone. Out of this damned mansion. Out of their reach. You can't tell me you haven't thought about it." Luke stared at him, his jaw tightening. Thinking about it and doing it are two different things. You know what happens to escapees? They don't just kill you, they make an example out of you, out of everyone. And what's the alternative? Jake shot back, his voice rising despite the strain. "Stay here? Let them beat us, bleed us dry, or worse?" Luke looked away, his hands clenching into fists. He had thought about it, dreamed of it even, but every time the harsh reality crushed the fleeting hope. "There's no way out," Luke said finally, his voice flat. "This place is a fortress. The guards, the gates. Even if we made it out, they'd hunt us down." Jake swung his legs over the edge of his cot, his movements slow and pained. "There's always a way out. You just have to find it." Luke's eyes flicked to Jake's face, noting the determined set of his jaw, despite the bruises and cuts. "You sound like you already have a plan." "Not yet," Jake admitted, "but I'm working on it. I've been watching the guards, the routines. There are gaps, small ones, but they're there." Luke shook his head. "It's suicide." "Maybe," Jake said, leaning forward, his voice low and urgent. "But if we stay, we're dead anyway. At least out there we have a chance. Don't you want more than this? Don't you want to fight back?" Luke didn't answer. The fire in his chest burned brighter, but it was tempered by a crushing weight of fear and doubt. Jake sighed and leaned back against the wall, his expression softening. "I'm not saying we do it tomorrow. But think about it, Luke. We can't just survive. We have to live." Luke stared at the floor, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows across the room. Jake's words echoed in his mind, planting a seed that would take root whether he wanted it to or not. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, a faint smile tugging at his split lip. "That's all I ask." The silence crept back in, thicker than before. The drip of water in the corner became impossible to ignore, slow, deliberate, like it was counting something out. Luke leaned back against the cold stone wall, closing his eyes, but the sounds of the mansion didn't fade. They shifted. Footsteps above, a door opening, then something else, faint, distant, not quite a cry, not quite a breath. He frowned, listening. The sound lingered, threading through the dark, softening into something quieter, closer, breathing. She had been holding her breath for too long. The room was eerily quiet, the air thick and unmoving, yet beneath it something lingered. A rhythm, slow, steady, dripping. Her body ached as she swung her legs over the side of the bed, the stiffness settling deep into her bones. She ignored it, she had grown used to pain. The room around her was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the faint metallic tang of blood that seemed to linger everywhere in the mansion. Standing slowly, she crossed to the cracked mirror above the wash basin. She hesitated before looking at her reflection, dreading what she might see. When she finally raised her eyes, she barely recognized herself. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with faint veins tracing delicate patterns beneath the surface. Bruises dotted her collarbone and shoulders, shadows left by Lord Varian's cruel hands, and the bite marks on her neck were raw, still oozing slightly. Her fingers brushed the marks absently, and she winced at the tenderness. The wounds would heal quickly. They always did, but they left scars that told a story she wished she could forget. Her gaze traveled downward, taking in her slender frame. Despite her injuries, there was still an undeniable beauty to her, stark and haunting. Her brunette hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, framing her face with its sharp cheekbones and full lips. Her emerald green eyes, though dulled by exhaustion, still shone wit. A faint fire, a reminder of the spirit she refused to let die. She pulled at the thin fabric of her nightgown, revealing the soft curve of her breasts and the bruises that marred her ribcage. Her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, the tension in her body a constant weight. Her legs bore the same marks of her captivity, scratches, faint scars, and bruises from years of being used and discarded. Yet even in her battered state, there was a graceful strength in the way she moved, a quiet resilience that refused to bow entirely to the vampires who claimed ownership of her. She straightened her posture, brushing her hair back from her face. She was still here. She was still alive. And as long as she could stand, there was still a chance for something more. The door creaked open, breaking her reverie. 2 slaves entered, their heads bowed and eyes averted. She recognized them, number 0847 and number 1461. The taller one, 1461, carried a small tray with an iron tablet and a glass of water. "Your supplements, Miss," he said quietly, his voice low and devoid of emotion. She took the tablet, her fingers brushing against his briefly as she accepted the glass of water. She swallowed the pill, the metallic taste spreading across her tongue as she drank. "Thank you," she murmured, though she knew they weren't supposed to speak. 1461's gaze flicked to her face for the barest moment, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was something in his expression, an unspoken defiance, a flicker of humanity that had not been extinguished by this place. "Come on!" the other slave hissed, pulling at his arm. 1461 lowered his head and followed his companion out of the room, the door shutting heavily behind them. She turned back to the mirror, her fingers brushing against the bite marks on her neck once more. The fire in her green eyes sparked again, stronger this time. For all their power, the vampires couldn't take everything from her. Not yet. The grand dining hall was an opulent chamber of decadence and death. Crystal chandeliers cast flickering light over the long table, where vampires reclined on intricately carved chairs, their movements languid and predatory. The pets knelt at their master's feet, dressed in thin silks that did little to shield them from the chill of the room or the leering gazes of the vampires. She sat at Lord Varian's feet, her heart pounding as she stared at the polished marble floor. Her stomach churned at the sounds around her, the laughter, the murmured taunts, the occasional muffled sobs of pets who had displeased their masters. She didn't dare look up, but she didn't have to. She could hear everything. To her left, she caught a faint whimper. A younger girl, no more than 18, knelt trembling beside her vampire. The man's long fingers trailed up the girl's arm, his nails scraping over her skin like a predator toying with its prey. When the girl flinched, he chuckled darkly and leaned down, whispering something in her ear that made her eyes widen in fear. Moments later, he yanked her up by the hair and dragged her from the room, his fangs bared in a grin that promised nothing good. The pet turned her gaze back to the floor, bile rising in her throat. She'd seen it too many times, the way some pets simply disappeared after these feasts. They weren't killed outright. The vampires preferred to savor their suffering first. Some were drained, others broken, their bodies discarded like ruined toys when they no longer served a purpose. To her right, another vampire had his pet, a pale wayfish boy, pressed against his leg, stroking the boy's hair absent-mindedly as though petting an animal. She recognized the vampire, Lady Aveline, the same one who had punished Jake earlier. Lady Aveline's crimson lips curled into a smirk as she leaned down to whisper something in the boy's ear. He froze, his hands trembling as he clutched at the fabric of her gown. "She's crueler than most, Lord Varian's V," Ois murmured from above, startling her. She stiffened as his hands slid into her hair, tilting her head back to meet his gaze. Aveline doesn't like to keep her pets long. A shame, really. They burn out so quickly under her particular attentions. Her gaze flicked to Lady Aveline, whose sharp green eyes glittered with malice as she traced a fingernail along the boy's jawline. "You're lucky," Varian continued, his voice a silken whisper. "You've lasted longer than most." Before she could respond, his hand tightened in her hair, pulling her head back sharply. A gasp escaped her lips as he leaned down, his cold breath brushing against her neck. "You're distracted tonight," he murmured, his tone soft but edged with warning. "I'm sorry, my lord," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not good enough," he replied. His lips brushed her skin, and then she felt the sharp sting of his fangs piercing her neck. The pain was searing at first, radiating down her spine and into her limbs. But as the seconds stretched, the sensation shifted. Warmth flooded her veins, mingling with the ache, leaving her breathless and dazed. She hated how her body betrayed her, how the vampire's bite induced a heady, euphoric haze, even as it drained her life. Her vision blurred, and when she dared to glance up, she saw his eyes. They glowed a deep crimson, like embers in a dying fire, burning with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "You taste of defiance," Varian murmured, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down her spine. "It's intoxicating." Her fingers curled into fists, her nails biting into her palms as she fought to remain still. She couldn't show weakness. Not here. Not now. When he finally pulled back, she sagged against his leg, her breaths shallow and uneven. He licked his lips, his eyes still glowing as he regarded her with something between amusement and hunger. "Good girl," he said softly, stroking her hair as though she were a favored pet. "Now behave, or next time I won't be so gentle." The evening dragged on, the air thick with the scent of wine and blood. The vampires grew bolder as the night deepened, their hands wandering over their pets, their whispers turning to cruel laughter. One pet-a-boy, barely older than she was lifted onto the table, his master pinning him down as the other vampires laughed and jeered. Her stomach churned, and she looked away, her nails digging into her palms. Her own body trembled as Lord Varian's hand remained on her shoulder, his grip firm but not painful. Yet she knew his kindness was a facade, one he could strip away at a moment's notice. Through it all, her gaze kept drifting to the slaves who moved around the room, clearing plates and refilling glasses. One of them, 1461, stood out, his movements precise but tense. She recognized the quiet anger in his eyes, the barely concealed fire that matched her own. When their eyes met briefly, a spark passed between them. It was fleeting, but it was enough to remind her that she wasn't alone in this nightmare. As the feast finally came to an end, Lord Varian stood, pulling her to her feet. Her legs wobbled, but she steadied herself, casting one last glance at 1461 before she was led away. His eyes followed her for only a second, no longer than that, but it was enough. Something passed between them, not words, not even understanding. Just a quiet, stubborn refusal to be hollowed out completely. As she was pulled through the towering doors and back into the winding corridors, the sounds of the hall faded behind her laughter, footsteps, the scrape of chairs, until only the mansion remained. It breathed around her, slow, heavy, watching. The mansion was alive with its own dark pulse. Luke felt it now more than ever as he moved through its halls, like something vast breathing just beneath the stone. Every corridor, every doorway seemed to hold its gaze on him, waiting, its secrets pressing in from all sides. Today, he would glimpse more of its depths than he ever had before. Assigned to solo cleaning duties after the morning bloodletting, Luke welcomed the opportunity to wander further than the west wing and dining hall. He hoped the monotony of scrubbing and dusting would drown the restless anger still bubbling inside him from the sight of Jake's battered body the night before. The first rooms were typical of the high-ranking vampires, lavishly furnished with dark woods, velvet drapes, and ornate chandeliers. Each chamber bore the personality of its occupant. In one room, Luke found an unsettling collection of bones displayed in a glass cabinet, human by the looks of it. The vampire who resided there was known for her artistic tendencies, using the remains of those who displeased her to create macabre sculptures. In another, a male vampire's walls were lined with mirrors, not for vanity, but for punishment. Luke shuddered as he recalled hearing slaves talk about how the mirrors were enchanted to trap the reflections of those who angered him, forcing them to watch themselves waste away until death. Every room seemed to carry its own horrors, and Luke's anger simmered beneath the surface as he scrubbed floors and polished furniture. In one of the chambers, Luke encountered another vampire, lounging in a high-backed chair while sipping from a crystal goblet. The metallic scent in the air made it clear what he was drinking. A low whimper drew Luke's attention to the corner of the room. There, in a cage far too small for a human, was a young woman, her naked body marred by whip marks. Her arms were folded tightly around herself as though trying to hold together the last shreds of her dignity. "Beautiful, isn't she?" the vampire said lazily, noticing Luke's glance. Luke tightened his grip on the cleaning cloth in his hand. "Yes, my lord," he said through clenched teeth. The vampire chuckled. "Don't look so grim, slave. She's just a pet. They're made to endure." He drained the last of his goblet and waved Luke away. "Go on, then, unless you'd like to join her in the cage." Luke left quickly. The image of the caged woman burned into his mind. His fists trembled as he carried his cleaning supplies to the next room, but he knew there was nothing he could do, not yet. As the day wore on, Luke was assigned to clean near the mansion's forbidden east wing, a place spoken of only in hushed whispers among the slaves. It was said to house the chambers of the arch-vampire, the one who ruled over the mansion, and likely the entire region with absolute authority. The arch-vampire rarely left his chambers, but his presence was felt everywhere. Even the high-ranking vampires lowered their voices and tread carefully when speaking of him. Luke's heart raced as he approached the heavily guarded hallway leading to the arch-vampire's chambers. Two towering vampires in dark armor stood at the entrance, their expressions as cold and unyielding as the stone walls around them. "No closer." One of them barked as Luke moved within 10 paces of the doors. Luke nodded quickly, setting his bucket down and pretending to focus on scrubbing the floor. He risked a glance at the doors, massive and made of black iron, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when he looked at them too long. Rumors swirled among the slaves about what lay beyond those doors. Some said the arch-vampire kept an army of feral vampires chained in the depths, ready to unleash upon any who dared defy him. Others whispered that he could read the minds of everyone in the mansion, that he already knew every secret and plot before they even formed. As Luke cleaned, he caught snippets of conversation from the guards. "He's been restless lately," one muttered. "Can you blame him? The rebellion in the north grows stronger every day. It won't be long before they're at our gates." The other scoffed. "Let them come. He'll crush them like he always does." Luxie, ours pricked at the mention of a rebellion, but he kept his gaze fixed on the floor, scrubbing harder to mask his eavesdropping. Later that evening, Luke was sent to deliver a fresh vial of his blood to Lord Malric. one of the mansion's most enigmatic, high-ranking vampires. Malric's chambers were stark compared to the others, a simple desk, a few bookshelves, and an armchair by the window. The vampire himself sat behind the desk, his piercing gray eyes studying Luke as he entered. 1461, Malric said, his voice smooth but tinged with an edge of amusement. Come in. Luke placed the silver tray on the desk and stepped back, lowering his gaze. Interesting, Malric said, leaning back in his chair. You don't bow like the others. I mean no disrespect, my lord, Luke replied carefully. Malric smirked. Of course you don't, but it's refreshing. Most slaves are so broken. He rose from his chair, circling Luke slowly. There's something in your eyes. Defiance, perhaps. It's rare to see that here. Luke kept his expression neutral, but his heart raced. Malric stopped in front of him, his gaze sharp and calculating. Tell me, slave, do you plan to escape this place? Luke's breath caught, but he forced himself to remain calm. No, my lord. I serve the mansion. Malric chuckled, a low and knowing sound. You're a terrible liar, but don't worry, I find it entertaining. After all, it's been far too long since anyone had the courage to try. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. If you ever do decide to make a move, perhaps I could be of assistance. I'm not fond of the way the others treat humans, you see. It's distasteful. Luke met Malric's gaze briefly, searching for any sign of deception. The vampire's expression was unreadable. Go now, Malric said, stepping back, for someone less understanding decides to question you. Luke nodded, his mind racing as he left the room. He didn't trust Malric, but the vampire's words planted a seed of possibility, a dangerous but undeniable hope. It sat uneasily in his chest as he stepped back into the corridor, the mansion pressing in around him once more. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, slowly, he glanced back over his shoulder, half expecting the door to still be open, half expecting to find Malric watching him. Lord Malric had been watching him long before that glance. The halls of the mansion were quieter in the mornings, save for the faint echoes of slaves shuffling through their routines. He preferred these moments of near solitude before the feasts, before the politics, before the weight of his position pressed heavily upon him once again. Seated in his private chamber, Malric swirled a goblet of dark red liquid, his pale fingers caressing the rim. The blood was still warm, harvested mere moments ago, but it tasted stale to him. No matter how fresh, how rich, it was never enough. Not because he craved more, but because it no longer satiated him the way it did others of his kind. He cast his gaze toward the large window overlooking the courtyard. A group of slaves, heads bowed, moved like cattle under the watchful eyes of the guards. Somewhere among them was Luke, the human with defiance burning behind his weary eyes. Malric had noticed him more than once, the way his jaw clenched during meals, the subtle glances he exchanged with his companion. Luke hated his kind, and Malric couldn't blame him. The boy would drive a stake through my heart if he thought he had a chance, Malric mused aloud, his voice a quiet murmur. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A younger vampire stepped inside, bowing low. Lord Malric, the arch-vampire requests your presence for tonight's council meeting. Of course he does, Malric replied, waving the messenger away. The arch-vampire, with his endless schemes and taste for theatrics, ruled the mansion with an iron grip. Malric respected his power but despised his methods. Cruelty to the arch. Vampire was an art form, a means to remind humans and vampires alike of their place in his world. Once the messenger had gone, Malric's eyes fell upon the empty cage in the corner of his chamber. He didn't keep pets. The very idea repulsed him, enslaving a human for personal amusement, treating them as objects. His peers mocked him for it, of course. They called him soft, a traitor to his nature. But Malric had lived long enough to know that vampires were not gods. They were parasites, cursed to exist in the shadows of the world they'd conquered. For every vampire who reveled in bloodlust, there were others like him who saw the futility of it all. Survival, yes. Dominance, no. The slaves are not the only ones in chains, he thought bitterly, draining the goblet. Malric walked the eastern corridor, his boots clicking softly against the stone floors. The east wing was far quieter than the rest of the mansion, its halls lined with heavy, locked doors. These were the chambers of the arch-vampire, a place that even the most powerful avoided unless summoned. The guards stationed along the wing were unlike the others, hulking brutes with eyes as black as tar and expressions carved from stone. These were the arch-vampire's enhancements, former vampires who had willingly subjected themselves to his experiments in pursuit of greater strength and endurance. Malric allowed his gaze to linger on one of them, a towering figure with a jagged scar running down the length of his face. He looked more beast than man, his pale skin stretched taut over muscle that seemed ready to burst through his uniform. Rumors swirled that the enhancements came at a cost, a vampire's sanity. As Malric passed one of the locked doors, he caught a faint metallic sound, like chains dragging across stone. The smell of blood was stronger here, mixed with something acrid and chemical. The arch-vampire was at work again. The arch-vampire had no patience for vampires who overstepped their station or dared to challenge his authority. Those who fell out of favor were brought here, stripped of their arrogance and ambition, and transformed or destroyed in equal measure. Malric paused outside a particularly thick door, its edges sealed with iron. There were no sounds from within, but the cold radiating from the room was enough to chill even his immortal body. "They say he's working on something new," a voice murmured behind him. Malric turned to see a fellow noble, Lord Rafe, standing in the shadows. Rafe was a wiry vampire with sharp features and an unsettling smirk that seemed permanently etched onto his face. "What new horror has he conjured this time?" Malric replied dryly. "Something to ensure our kind never fall," Rafe said, his tone carrying equal parts reverence and fear. "Or so he claims." Malric said nothing. The arch-vampire's obsession with perfection had consumed him for centuries. He sought to mold their kind into something unstoppable, immune to sunlight, hunger, and even the passage of time. But Malric had seen what happened to those who failed the arch-vampire's trials. Their screams still echoed in his mind. As Malric approached the end of the corridor, his sharp hearing caught a faint whimper from one of the nearby doors. He slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing. Inside, a voice was speaking, low and deliberate. He didn't need to press his ear to the door to know who it belonged to. The arch-vampire himself rarely raised his voice, but his words carried the weight of authority. "You dared to challenge my judgment," the arch-vampire was saying, his tone ice-cold. "Do you understand what that means, child?" A muffled response followed, a female voice, trembling with fear. Malric didn't recognize it, but he knew its fate. Those who struck too far above their station, who dared to question the hierarchy, often found themselves in these chambers. Malric continued walking, unwilling to stay and listen. He had no intention of drawing the arch-vampire's attention, especially not now. His distaste for the cruelty of his kind was one thing, but even he was not foolish enough to openly oppose the arch-vampire. As he emerged from the east wing, Malric cast one final glance back at the guarded corridor. The arch-vampire ruled with fear, and his experiments were a testament to that power. But Malric couldn't help but wonder, how long could they cling to control through fear alone? How long before the cracks began to show? The arch-vampire was a force to be reckoned with, yes, but even the strongest forces could crumble under the weight of their own hubris. Later, as he crossed the west wing, Malric paused at a railing overlooking the dining hall. Below, the slaves cleaned and cleared the remnants of the earlier feast. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Luke, scrubbing the floor with mechanical precision. Malric could see the tension in the boy's shoulders, the quiet fury in the way he gripped the brush. He wondered if Luke even realized how transparent his anger was. Perhaps not. Perhaps he thought himself unreadable, a mere tool obeying orders. Malric smirked faintly. Defiance was a dangerous quality in a slave, but it was also the one he respected most. "Soon," he murmured, his voice lost in the cavernous expanse of the hall. "We'll see how far your courage truly goes." His gaze lingered on Luke a moment longer as the boy scrubbed the stone, tension coiled tight in his shoulders. It was already there. The question, the breaking point. Malric could see it forming long before the boy himself would dare to act on it. The cell was cold, as always, but Luke barely seemed to feel it. The thought had followed him back, unwelcome, persistent, coiling tighter the longer he sat there. He rested against the wall, arms on his knees, while Jake paced in front of him. Their conversation had shifted now from "We can't just keep doing this," Jake said, his voice low but filled with simmering anger. "Every day, we get weaker. And for what? To keep feeding them?" Luke sighed, his gaze fixed on the faint scratches on the wall marks left by countless slaves before them. "You think I don't know that? But this place? It's a fortress. We make one wrong move and we're dead." Jake stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "We're already dead, Luke. Just slower." Before Luke could respond, the sound of boots echoed down the hallway. The guards were coming. The slaves silently prepared themselves for whatever task was to be thrust upon them next. Luke clenched his fists, his mind still lingering on Jake's words. The room reeked of sterile alcohol and something faintly metallic. Blood, Luke realized, his stomach twisting. Slaves filed into the makeshift medical chamber, each stripped to their bare torsos, sweat glistening on their backs from the suffocating heat of the mansion. The guards loomed close, their eyes glinting with sadistic amusement as the slaves hesitated, the needles glinting ominously on the tray before them. Luke stepped forward reluctantly, his gaze flicking toward the corner of the room. There, sitting hunched and shivering on a narrow wooden bench, was the pet. Her green eyes darted nervously to each slave as they approached. She was stripped to her undergarments, her delicate shoulders marked with faint bruises and her hair slightly tangled, as though no one had cared enough to smooth it after the day's ordeals. Luke swallowed hard. She was stunning, even now, even in this place. Her beauty was almost surreal, a cruel reminder of the old world, of times when women like her were seen on television screens and magazines, not dragged through hell. The thin fabric clung to her figure, highlighting every curve. It felt wrong to notice, but he couldn't stop. She wasn't just beautiful. She was a symbol, a road of the humanity they'd lost. The pet caught him staring and flinched. "Next?" The head slave barked, snapping Luke out of his trance. He stepped forward, pulling off his shirt as the needle pierced his arm. The burn was immediate, sharp, and all too familiar. When it was the pet's turn, she hesitated. A guard smirked, his fingers twitching toward the whip at his belt. The head slave hissed under his breath, "Don't make a scene." Luke watched as the green-eyed pet moved to the center of the room, her hands trembling. The needle pressed into her arm, and a small sound escaped her lips. He felt something tighten in his chest. When she was done, she stumbled back to the bench, her hand clutching the sore spot on her arm. As the guards turned their attention away, she whispered, her voice a ghostly rasp. "Help me." Luke froze. He knew he should ignore her, should walk away like everyone else, but those eyes green as summer fields were impossible to look away from. "I can't," he whispered back, barely audible. Her lip quivered, but she nodded, resignation dulling the spark of hope in her gaze. As he turned to leave, her voice reached him again, quieter this time. "I'll die here. We all will." Luke sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the cold, cracked floor beneath his bare feet. Around him, the other slaves settled into their thin, scratchy bedding, their hollow faces turned away, their whispers drowned out by the rattling chains hanging from the walls. Jake was pacing again, his footsteps agitated and loud enough to draw annoyed glances. He clenched and unclenched his fists, his frustration palpable. "You're going to wear a hole in the floor," Luke muttered, rubbing his temples. Jake turned sharply, his voice low but filled with intensity. "We can't keep doing this, Luke. Day in, day out, letting them bleed us dry. We're just waiting to die." Luke sighed, leaning back against the wall. You think I don't know that? But rushing headfirst into an escape isn't bravery, it's stupidity. We don't have a plan, Jake. No tools, no information, nothing. Jake's eyes burned with fury. So what? You want to rot here until they throw your lifeless body into the fire pits? Because that's all we're heading toward. Luke stayed silent, his jaw tightening. Jake sat down across from him, his voice dropping to a whisper. We need more people. They're not just going to let us waltz out of here. If we find other slaves who know things we don't, maybe we stand a chance. Luke shook his head. More people means more risk. Someone talks, we're dead before we even start. Jake leaned in closer. And what about her? You think she deserves to stay here? You think she'll survive another year with that monster draining her dry? Luke froze. The image of her haunted him, the desperation in her whispered plea for help. He didn't want to admit it, but Jake was right. Still, his voice came out firm. She's a liability, Jake. Bringing her along would paint a target on all of us. If we're caught, it won't just be the guards. Every vampire in this mansion will be hunting us down. Jake scoffed. You don't think they'll hunt us anyway? What's the difference? A voice from the shadows cut through their argument. The difference is numbers. Luke and Jake turned to see a wiry figure stepping into the dim torchlight. It was Elias, one of the quieter slaves who kept to himself. His sunken eyes gleamed with sharp intelligence, his gaunt face betraying a calculating mind. Elias crossed his arms, his tone calm but edged with mockery. You take her with you, and you might as well hang a bell around your necks. They'll never stop hunting. But a few ragged slaves? They might not bother wasting the effort. They've got hundreds more where we came from. Jake stood, squaring up to Elias. And who asked you? Elias didn't flinch, his smirk widening. No one. But I hear things. And I can think something you two seem to struggle with. You're not getting out of here without a plan. And you sure as hell won't do it alone. Luke frowned, studying Elias. Why would you help us? Elias shrugged. Because you're idiots, and you'll get yourselves killed if someone doesn't step in. I'm not strong, but I'm smart. Smarter than both of you put together. And trust me, brains matter more than brawn when it comes to slipping through cracks. Jake looked ready to argue, but Luke raised a hand, silencing him. What do you want in return? Elias's smirk faded, his expression darkening. The same thing you do. Freedom. But I'll tell you this, if you're taking her, count me out. She's a death sentence. Jake glared, but before he could reply, Luke spoke. We'll think about it. Elias nodded, retreating back into the shadows. Do that. Just don't take too long. Your window's closing faster than you think. The dorm fell silent again, the weight of the conversation hanging over them like a shroud. Jake climbed into his bunk, his anger still simmering, but Luke remained seated, staring into the darkness. His mind drifted back to a memory he had tried to bury, the day the vampires came for his family. He had been 10 years old, hiding under the kitchen table as his mother, father, and older sister were dragged into the living room. He had watched, trembling and powerless as they were ripped apart limb by limb, their screams echoing in his ears. Blood pooled across the floor, staining the pristine carpet as the vampires fed. When they finally found him, he hadn't even screamed. He'd been too numb, too broken. Now the memory didn't bring fear or sadness. It brought a cold, burning resolve. He wouldn't let that happen again. Not to Jake, not to her, not to anyone. For the first time, the idea of escape didn't feel like a distant, impossible dream. It felt necessary. The summons came unexpectedly late in the night. The vampire escort was silent, his footsteps echoing ominously in the halls as he led Luke through the labyrinthine mansion. The destination, however, was unmistakable: Malric's chambers. When Luke entered, the room radiated quiet menace. The walls were lined with ancient tomes, their spines gilded with symbols that seemed to shift under the flickering firelight. At the center, behind a massive desk, sat Malric. He exuded a regal calm, his crimson gaze sharp enough to strip away lies. "Ah, the bold one," Malric said smoothly, motioning for Luke to sit. Luke obeyed, gripping the edge of his chair to steady himself. "I understand you've been restless," Malric began, his voice like velvet over steel. Such a dangerous quality. Restlessness. It can lead to hope, rebellion, even ruin. "Tell me, Luke, what is it you hope to gain?" Luke hesitated, weighing his words. "To leave this place alive," he said finally. "Alive." Malric let the word linger, his lips curving into a faint smile. "An ambitious goal. And what of those you leave behind? Are they worth sacrificing for your freedom?" Luke's fists clenched. "If I stay, I'll die. So will they. At least outside, we have a chance." Malric rose, circling Luke with a predator's grace. "A chance," he echoed, his voice quieter. "And do you understand the weight of what you ask? Freedom is never without cost." He stopped behind Luke, placing a cold hand on his shoulder. "But perhaps you already know that. Let's see." A flash of silver caught Luke's eye as Malric drew a slender blade and pricked his wrist. Blood welled up, and Malric dipped his finger into it, bringing it to his lips. His eyes flared with crimson light as he tasted the blood. "Defiance," Malric murmured, his voice barely audible. "Grief, pain, and hope. Such dangerous emotions." He leaned closer, his voice like a whisper in Luke's ear. "I'll offer you this. My help, but only so far. Your actions are yours alone. And remember, what you think is freedom may bring ruin to others." Luke turned to meet Malric's gaze, his voice steady. "I'll bear that weight." Malric's smile widened, though it did not reach his eyes. "Good, now go. And tread carefully, Luke. Ripples can become waves." Jake was summoned under far less ominous circumstances, though his task was no less grim. The head slave handed him a bowl of tepid water and a rag. "Room 5. The pets barely holding together. Clean her up." When he stepped into the room, the sight stopped him cold. The green-eyed pet sat by the corner of the bed, her hair disheveled and face pale. Her exposed arms bore fresh bruises and welts, a cruel reminder of her place in the mansion. On the mattress behind her lay another woman, her condition far worse. Jake hesitated, his throat dry. "I don't bother," the pet said flatly, her voice brittle. "It's not like anyone cares." Jake knelt by the other woman, dipping the rag into the water. "What's her name?" The pet watched him closely. "Why does it matter?" "It matters," Jake said firmly, his voice quiet. The pet hesitated before replying. "Lexi." Jake nodded, wiping Lexi's face gently. She groaned softly, her lips moving but no words forming. The pet crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. "Have you decided yet?" Jake glanced at her. "Decided what?" "On helping us," she said bluntly. "Her and me. We're running out of time." Jake didn't respond immediately, focusing instead on Lexi's wounds. Finally, he said, "I care about you." The pet snorted, her lips twisting into a bitter smile. "You don't even know me." "Then tell me," Jake said, looking up at her. The pet's eyes narrowed. "Why? So you can pretend we're equals? You think knowing my name will change anything?" "Maybe," Jake said simply. For a long moment she stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Maria," she said finally. Jake repeated it softly, as if committing it to memory. "Maria, don't say it like it means something," she snapped, though her voice faltered. "Names don't matter here." Back in the dormitory, Jake paced like a caged animal while Luke sat stiffly on his bunk. The tension between them was palpable. "She wants us to take Lexi," Jake blurted, stopping abruptly. Luke's head snapped up, his face darkening. "Absolutely not! She's dying. Jake shot back. "We can't just leave her. You're asking us to carry dead weight," Luke hissed. "Do you even understand what you're risking? She's not dead weight." Jake's voice rose, though he quickly lowered it, glancing toward the door. She's one of us." "No, she's not," Luke said coldly. "She's a pet. So you don't see it because you're too close, but taking her is suicide." Jake stepped closer, his fists clenched. "You're the one who went to Malric for help. What gives you the right to decide who we leave behind?" Luke shot to his feet, his voice low and furious. "Because I'm thinking with my head, not my heart. Do you think Malric will save us if we start dragging along every lost cause?" Jake flinched at the mention of Malric. "What did he say?" Luke hesitated, then sighed. "He said he'd help, but only so far. He's testing me, Jake. Testing us. And he made it clear every action has consequences." Jake stared at him, his jaw tightening. "And you trust him?" "No," Luke admitted. "But we don't have a choice." Jake fell silent, the weight of their predicament settling heavily between them. From the shadows, a pair of ears listened intently, a sly grin spreading across unseen lips. The air in the dorm was thick with tension, a stifling silence interrupted only by the distant clinking of chains and the muffled cries of the punished. Luke sat against the cold stone wall, his arms folded, staring at the flickering lantern hanging from the ceiling. Jake paced the length of the room, his fists clenched, his face shadowed with frustration. "So, that's it?" Jake finally snapped. "You're just gonna stand there glaring at me like I'm the problem?" Luke didn't respond immediately, his jaw tightening. "Taking the pet is already a risk, Jake. But her friend? That's on you." Jake stopped pacing and turned to face him, his voice rising. "We're already neck deep in this. What difference does one more make? You saw what they did to her friend. Lexi's on her last legs, Luke. They'll kill her. And that's exactly the point," Luke shot back, his voice sharp. "She's weak, Jake. She's a liability. If she can't keep up, I'll carry her if I have to." Jake interrupted, his voice breaking. "I'm not leaving them behind. Either we're all free, or what's the damn point?" Luke exhaled slowly, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Fine, but if it falls apart because of them, the consequences are on your head, not mine." Jake's expression softened slightly, but the tension between them lingered. "They're not just pets, Luke, they're people, just like us." Luke's gaze flickered towards a small barred window high on the wall. "No, not like us, we're slaves, they're something else." The following evening, as the dorm quieted and the slaves settled into uneasy sleep, Elias crept closer to where Luke and Jake sat whispering in the shadows. His wiry frame moved with practiced caution, his sharp eyes flickering with curiosity. "Still talking about that, are you?" Elias asked, his voice low but tinged with amusement. Luke stiffened, but Jake leaned forward, his tone defensive. "What do you mean, still? You've been eavesdropping again." Elias smirked, unbothered. "Hard not to when you're as loud as a pair of drunken guards. But I have some information that might be useful." Jake exchanged a wary glance with Luke, who nodded begrudgingly. "Go on." Elias crouched beside them, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I've been hearing things. The guards, they're not as careful as they think. They talk when they think no one's listening. One of them mentioned the feral prison." Luke frowned. "What about it?" "They're renovating it," Elias continued. "It's not secure right now. Apparently, it's been a mess for weeks. If you're planning something, that might be your way out." Jake's brow furrowed. "And what the hell is a feral prison?" Elias's expression darkened, and he glanced over his shoulder as though expecting someone to appear out of the shadows. "It's where they keep the ones who lose control, the ones who don't feed for too long. They go feral, mindless, monstrous things that only care about blood." Luke's stomach churned. "Why haven't we heard about this before?" Elias smirked. "Because they don't want you to know. If you knew how much they need us, you'd realize they're just as vulnerable as we are. Maybe more. The weight of Elias's words hung in the air, and for a moment, none of them spoke. Finally, Jake broke the silence. So, they're just animals if they don't drink? Worse than animals, Elias replied. From what I've heard, they don't care who they kill, human or vampire. They'll tear through anything until they fed. It's why the renovations are taking so long. They're scared of what happens if something breaks loose. Later that night, as the dorms fell into silence, Luke and Jake sat huddled together, their voices barely audible over the hum of restless breaths. "We need a distraction," Jake said, his tone resolute. Luke raised an eyebrow. "Something big enough to pull their attention away from us. But how?" Jake shook his head. "Haven't figured that part out yet. But we'll need more than just us to pull it off." Luke leaned back against the wall, his mind racing. Elias doesn't need to know about the girls. Not yet. The fewer people who know, the better. Jake hesitated, then nodded. Agreed. But he's right about one thing. We can use that prison to our advantage, if it's as vulnerable as he says. "It's a death trap," Luke interrupted. "If those things get out, they won't stop until they've killed everything in their path." Jake's expression hardened. "Better them than us." Luke didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the dark ceiling above. He couldn't argue with Jake's logic, but the thought of unleashing something so dangerous sent a chill through him. A guard barked the order, his tone sharp and final, and Jake obeyed without question. He wasn't sure why he'd been chosen, but when he arrived at the pet's chambers, the sight before him made his stomach churn. Lexi lay on a narrow cot, her fragile body covered in bruises and shallow cuts. Her breathing was faint, her lips cracked and dry. Maria knelt beside her, her hands shaking as she tried to clean the wounds with a damp cloth. "You're late," Maria said sharply, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. Jake flinched but said nothing, moving quickly to her side. "I came as soon as they called me," he muttered, setting down the supplies he'd been given. Maria looked up at him, her piercing gaze heavy with suspicion and exhaustion. "Gosh, she's worse today. They've been pushing her too hard." Jake glanced at Lexi, his chest tightening. "What happened?" "They said she wasn't fast enough," Maria replied bitterly, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "So they made an example of her." Jake clenched his jaw, his hands trembling as he began tending to Lexi's wounds. "They're monsters," he muttered under his breath. Maria's expression softened for a moment, but her tone remained guarded. "Do you still think we're not worth the risk?" Jake froze, his hand hovering over a particularly deep cut. He looked up at her, guilt flashing across his face. "You told him, didn't you?" Maria pressed, her voice low but insistent. Jake swallowed hard. "I did, and—" Jake hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Luke's hesitant. He thinks it's too dangerous." Maria let out a bitter laugh, her voice laced with frustration. "Of course he does. It's always easier to look the other way, isn't it?" "It's not like that," Jake said quickly. He's scared. For all of us." "And what about you?" Maria demanded, her eyes locking onto his. "Are you scared too?" Jake hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm scared of what will happen if we don't try. You and Lexi. You don't deserve this. None of us do." Maria's gaze softened, a flicker of something, hope, maybe, crossing her face. "Then help us, please. I'm begging you, Jake." Jake's throat tightened, and he looked down at Lexi, her frail body trembling beneath his touch. "We will," he said softly. "I promise." Maria exhaled shakily, her shoulders sagging with relief. But her expression quickly hardened again. "You have to convince him, Jake. If he doesn't agree, he'll agree," Jake interrupted, his voice firm. "I'll make sure of it." Maria studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes searching his face. "You're different," she said finally. "Not like the others." Jake looked up at her, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" Maria hesitated, then shook her head. "It doesn't matter, just don't let me down." "I won't," Jake said firmly. Maria nodded, her expression unreadable, and turned back to Lexi, gently brushing a strand of hair from her friend's face. "She doesn't have much time left, Jake. If we don't act soon." Jake's chest tightened and he nodded. "We will, I promise." The dormitory reeked of damp stone, sweat, and despair. Luke sat on the edge of his cot, his muscles aching from the day's labor. The flickering lantern cast jagged shadows across the walls, illuminating the tired, hollow faces of the slaves around him. The air was thick with unspoken fear, a constant companion in this house of nightmares. Across the room, Jake leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his face hard as he watched the iron door. Any moment now the guards would bark their orders, and the night's torment would begin anew. When the door finally creaked open, it wasn't the guards who entered, but Michael, a wiry, sharp-featured slave whose every word dripped with malice. Behind him, several other slaves shuffled in, their expressions wary. "Rise and shine, pigs," Michael sneered, his voice carrying a grating edge. "Big night ahead. Pets need tending, and lucky you're the chosen ones tonight." Luke exchanged a glance with Jake. Neither moved immediately, but Michael's sharp eyes caught their hesitation. "Don't make me repeat myself," Michael snapped, stepping into the room fully. He kicked the foot of a cot where another slave lay curled, too exhausted to rise. "Up, you useless piece of meat! You think the masters will care if I leave you bleeding on this floor?" The man scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with fear. Satisfied, Michael turned his attention to Jake and Luke. "They're waiting," he said with mock sweetness. "The pretty little pets need their precious dresses, and you two get the honor of playing housemaids." Jake's fists clenched at his sides, but Luke placed a steadying hand on his arm. As the group of slaves followed Michael down the dimly lit corridor, he glanced over his shoulder and added, "Oh, and just so we're clear, you screw this up, you're dead. Important meeting tonight. The masters don't want to see so much as a hair out of place. We've got high-ranking bloodsuckers coming in, arch-vampires, heads of departments. You know what that means?" No one answered. Michael sneered. "It means you're nothing. Less than nothing. One mistake and we're all on the menu. So you better make sure those pets shine." Luke's stomach tightened, and he could feel the tension ripple through the others. An important meeting meant heightened scrutiny, tighter security, and an even greater risk of punishment. When they reached the pets' chambers, Michael shoved the door open with unnecessary force. Inside, several pets stood waiting in various states of disarray. Their delicate frames were wrapped in thin linens, their expressions a mixture of fear and resignation. Maria and another pet Lex stood near the far wall, their fragile forms outlined by the dim lantern light. Lexi's trembling was almost imperceptible, but Luke caught it as she flinched at the sound of Michael's voice. "Well, well," Michael said, his lips curling into a cruel smile as his eyes scanned the room. "Look at this pathetic lot. You call yourselves pets? More like stray mutts." He moved to a petite girl with dark curls who stood nervously clutching her linen wrap. "What are you shaking for?" Michael sneered, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Afraid they'll notice you're useless even when you're dressed up?" The girl lowered her head, biting her lip to keep from crying. Michael laughed harshly and moved to another pet, this one a taller girl with striking blonde hair. "And you," he said, circling her like a predator, "don't get too comfortable. Just because they like your face doesn't mean you're safe. One wrong move and you're nothing but leftovers. Michael grabbed a dress from a nearby rack and tossed it at Lexi, the fabric smacking her in the face. "Here, try not to ruin it with your filth." Lexi fumbled with the dress, her hands shaking as she tried to untangle the material. Maria stepped closer to her, her movements protective, but Michael was quicker. "Oh, don't worry, princess," he said, smirking at Maria. "Your turn's coming. I've got something extra special for you." He pulled another dress from the rack, this one a deep red that shimmered in the dim light. He held it up mockingly. "Bet you think this'll make you look like a queen, huh? Hate to break it to you, sweetheart, but no matter how pretty the dress, you'll always be just another piece of meat." Maria's green eyes narrowed, a spark of defiance flaring in their depths. But she said nothing, her jaw tightening as she endured Michael's taunts. Other slaves moved quietly around the room, fetching water, combing hair, and helping the other pets into their dresses. The air was thick with tension, each movement calculated to avoid drawing Michael's attention. Michael lingered near Maria, his smirk growing crueler. "You think you're better than the others, don't you?" Maria didn't flinch. "I think you're wasting your breath." The slap came fast and hard, Michael's hand connecting with Maria's cheek in a sharp crack that echoed through the room. She stumbled but didn't fall, her defiance still burning in her eyes even as a red welt blossomed across her skin. "Enough!" Jake's voice thundered through the room as he stepped forward, his body tense with barely restrained fury. Michael turned on him, a twisted smile spreading across his face. "Careful, big man. Don't forget your place." Luke stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "Let's just get this done. The masters are waiting." Michael lingered for a moment, his gaze darting between Luke and Jake. Finally he stepped back, his smirk returning. "Fine, but don't think I'll forget this." With that, he stormed out, leaving the door ajar behind him. As soon as he was gone, Jake moved to Maria's side, his hands hovering uncertainly. "I'm fine." Maria cut him off, her voice sharp but not unkind. She turned to Lexi, helping her with the dress. "Let's just get this over with." Jake looked like he wanted to say more, but Luke placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward the rack of clothes. "Not here," he said quietly. "We'll deal with him later." Jake nodded reluctantly, his anger still simmering just beneath the surface. The clanging of iron gates rang through the dormitory, jolting the slaves awake. Luke sat up from the thin mat on the floor, rubbing the back of his neck as the heavy stomp of boots grew louder. A guard stormed in, his whip coiled tightly in his hand, his expression grim. "Get up!" he barked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "All of you! The arch-vampire has summoned a gathering, and guests from across the region are coming. You will scrub this mansion spotless, prepare food and blood offerings, and ensure everything is in place. Do not make me repeat myself." The slaves scrambled to their feet, fear evident in their every move. Luke exchanged a glance with Jake, who muttered under his breath, "Another damned show for their egos. Enough talking." The guard snapped, cracking his whip against the floor. "Move!" The mansion was alive with frantic activity. Slaves darted through the hallways, scrubbing floors, polishing silverware, and hauling supplies. In the kitchens, the air was thick with the smell of freshly baked bread and roasted meat, though none of it would ever touch the slaves' lips. Luke and a small group of slaves were assigned to the basement where the blood stores were kept. It was a cold, dimly lit room lined with shelves stacked with glass blood bags of varying shades. A guard hovered nearby, barking instructions. "Sort them by blood type first," he growled. "Then by the pets' ages. The youngest one's blood must be at the front. Our guests deserve the best." Luke set to work, his hands trembling slightly as he handled the cold, slick bags. The labels were handwritten, each one bearing a pet's assigned number, blood type, and age. He tried not to think about the faces behind the numbers, but it was impossible. He recognized some of the numbers' pets he'd seen in passing, their hollow eyes staring back at him. Careful with that. The guard snapped as Luke fumbled with the bag. Sorry, Luke murmured, quickly placing it on the shelf. He worked methodically, separating the bags into neat rows. AB positive, O negative, A negative. The younger pet's blood had a richer, deeper hue, almost shimmering in the dim light. It made him sick to think of the vampires savoring it like a fine wine. By the time he finished, his back ached and his hands were stiff from the cold, but there was no time to rest. The guard ushered them back upstairs, where the preparations continued. In the dining hall, Luke joined another group of slaves scrubbing the floor. The room was a masterpiece of Gothic elegance, high vaulted ceilings with intricate carvings, dark wooden paneling, and a table so long it seemed to stretch into eternity. Every inch of this room must shine, a guard barked, his eyes scanning the group. If I find even a speck of dust, you'll pay for it. Luke dropped to his knees, a bucket of soapy water at his side, and began scrubbing the cold stone floor. Around him, the other slaves worked in silence, their movements hurried and efficient. As he worked, 2 vampires entered the hall, their voices low but clear enough for Luke to catch fragments of their conversation. The resistance in the west is growing bolder, one said, his tone clipped. They've attacked 3 caravans this month. They're fools, the other replied. The arch-vampire is preparing the Legion to wipe them out. They won't last another week. Luke's hands paused mid-scrub, his heart pounding in his chest. Resistance. The word filled him with a cautious sense of hope, though it was tempered by the vampire's confidence in their destruction. He forced himself to keep working, but his mind raced. If there were people out there fighting back, maybe there was still a chance for something better, something beyond these walls. In the East Wing, Jake was among a group of slaves preparing the pets' chambers. The room was draped in luxury, silk curtains, plush cushions, and delicate glass vials of perfume. Each pet had their own designated space, a mockery of comfort that only underscored their captivity. Michael stood at the center, his arms crossed, his voice dripping with disdain. You call this clean? I wouldn't let a feral sleep in here, let alone a pet. Jake clenched his fists but said nothing, focusing instead on his task. He arranged the cushions meticulously, his jaw tightening as Michael moved from one slave to another, hurling insults like stones. Faster, you idiots, Michael sneered. The pets need to be dressed and ready. And for the love of blood, someone polished the feeding bowls. They look like they've been dragged through the mud. In an adjoining room, the tension thickened as Lord Baston, Maria's owner, loomed over her. Baston was tall and lean, with an unsettling elegance that belied his cruelty. His sharp features were framed by dark hair, and his piercing gray eyes held a permanent glint of malice. Ilya stood trembling before him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. You've disappointed me, Maria, Baston said, his voice soft yet venomous. Your appearance is underwhelming. How am I to present you to the arch-vampire when you look like this? I'm sorry, master, Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. Bastion's lips curled into a cruel smile. Sorry won't suffice. Without warning, he grabbed her arm, yanking her toward him. His fangs gleamed as they descended, their tips glinting with silver, a feature that kept the blood flowing longer, preventing it from clotting. Maria gasped as his teeth pierced her neck, her body tensing as he drank deeply. The room was silent except for the faint sound of her blood being drained, a sickening rhythm that sent a chill through Jake's spine. Bastion pulled away after what felt like an eternity, his tongue flicking over his lips as he savored the taste. Maria slumped to the floor, her skin pale and her breathing shallow. "Clean her up," Bastian ordered coldly, addressing the nearest slaves, "and make sure she's presentable this time. I won't tolerate another failure." As he swept out of the room, Jake rushed to Maria's side. She was barely conscious, her body trembling with exhaustion. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice was weak. Jake's fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wanted to scream, to fight, to make Bastian pay for what he'd done. But all he could do was help Maria to her feet and guide her to a chair. Michael's mocking voice cut through the air. "Look at her. Useless, just like the rest of them." "Shut your mouth, Michael," Jake snapped, his voice low but dangerous. Michael smirked, unbothered. "Careful, Jake. You're sounding a little too attached. They're just pets, after all. Replaceable." Jake turned away, his chest heaving with suppressed rage. The great hall of the mansion, cold and vast, was cloaked in an oppressive silence. Darkness hung in the air, disturbed only by the faint flicker of crimson torches casting jagged shadows along the walls. The arch-vampire entered first, his figure a monolith of power. His crimson robes whispered across the marble floor, and the air around him seemed to shiver. Though his face was timeless, his eyes held the weight of countless centuries, twin voids of malice and intellect. He was known as Valerius Duskborn, the first of their kind, a being so ancient that even the myths spoke of him with hushed reverence. His abilities were whispered legends, the manipulation of shadows, bending them to his will, and mastery of dark affinity magic capable of unraveling flesh or binding his enemies in chains of blackened tendrils. A katana rested at his side, its hilt adorned with ancient runes that pulsed faintly like a living heart. Behind him, the heads of departments flanked him like sentinels, each stepping into the hall with the grace of predators. Lord Malric, his sharp features impassive but his aura betraying the glint of cunning, walked with practiced ease. Beside him was Lady Alara Nightvale, a statuesque vampire whose porcelain skin contrasted sharply with the dark crimson gown she wore. Her pale hand rested lightly on her own katana, a blade rumored to have tasted the blood of an entire kingdom. Her reputation for commanding the coven's internal affairs with an iron will and cruel efficiency made her feared even among her peers. Close behind was Ephraim Calder, Maria's master. His presence was quieter but no less intimidating, his emerald eyes gleaming with amusement and malice. His silver-edged katana swayed at his side, a weapon stained with the blood of countless humans and vampires alike. 4 more heads followed, each distinct yet bound by the same ruthless aura. Cryos Valamir, a towering brute with alabaster skin and scars etched across his neck, his katana jagged and massive. Known for his strength and his ability to conjure crystalline barriers in combat, Cryos had crushed countless rebellions with sheer brutality. Saria Duskthorn, a lithe figure with jet-black hair that shimmered as if alive. She was known for her shape-shifting, able to assume forms as grotesque as they were beautiful. Her favorite was a monstrous hybrid of wolf and bat, a living nightmare unleashed on the battlefield. Draven Blackspire, a gaunt, silent figure cloaked in black. His telekinetic abilities allowed him to eviscerate his enemies with invisible force. His katana, thinner than the others, seemed to hum softly, as if craving the air of battle. Leora Vane, whose golden hair and deceptively angelic features masked a talent for weaving illusions. Entire armies had been led into traps by her spectral constructs, their minds too clouded to discern reality from the nightmare she spun. The hall was prepared to host not only the mansion's hierarchy, but also their guests 11 arch-vampires, each the ruler of a distant region. As they entered one by one, their presence seemed to darken the very air. Valerius greeted them with the calculated respect of an emperor welcoming his warlords. Each bowed deeply, their movements fluid and unnervingly precise. Among them, Lady Arundis Ashfall stood out, her alabaster gown soaked in dried blood, a macabre trophy of her latest conquest. Her katana was stained black, its power radiating even while dormant. She was known for her ability to turn her body to shadows, vanishing and reappearing at will to dispatch her prey. At her side was her head of region, Merrick Sunder, a hulking beast of a vampire. His katana was more akin to a cleaver, broad and vicious. Merrick's reputation for tearing apart his foes limb by limb was etched into the nightmares of the few humans who had survived his raids. The other arch-vampires and their heads followed, each one unique in both power and appearance. Among them were Azrael Thornweaver, with skin so pale it appeared translucent, his voice a haunting rasp that made mortals quiver. His ability to control the weather-summoning storms of blood rain was legendary. Kalina Mornave, whose delicate frame belied her savagery. Her affinity for ice magic had left entire regions frozen in time, their inhabitants locked in eternal screams of anguish. The introductions continued, each one more chilling than the last. The long obsidian table was adorned with crimson goblets and bloodstone carvings. A brazier at its center crackled with flames that burned black, casting sinister light across the faces of those seated. As the vampires took their places, the tension in the room was palpable. The weight of centuries of bloodshed, conquest, and betrayal hung thick in the air. Valerius rose, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the walls, and spoke with a voice that resonated through the marrow of every being present. "Welcome, my kin," he said, his lips curling into a predatory smile. "Tonight we convene not as conquerors or rivals, but as shepherds of this dark age. Let us discuss the future of our dominion, and ensure that no force, human or otherwise, will challenge the reign of the immortal." The Grand Council Chamber was a masterpiece of Gothic terror. Jagged columns of blackened stone loomed high, their surfaces etched with ancient symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim crimson light cast by floating braziers. The ceiling, an impossibly high dome, seemed to ripple as if the darkness itself was alive. At the center of the room stood a crescent-shaped obsidian table, its polished surface reflecting the faces of the most powerful vampires in existence. At the head of the table sat Valerius Duskborn, the arch-vampire of the Nightshade Collective. His presence was like a void, consuming all light and warmth. Shadows twisted and coiled around him like living things, retreating only when his golden eyes, gleaming like molten suns, swept across the room. His voice was low and resonant as he welcomed the arriving guests. The massive iron doors groaned open, admitting the first of the visitors. Lady Morrigan Dreadspire was the first to enter, her steps deliberate and soundless. Her skeletal frame was draped in tattered black silks, and her ashen skin clung tightly to her bones. Hollow sockets stared out from her skull-like face, faint green fire smoldering within. As she passed, a sickly, decayed smell lingered, and faint whispers echoed in the chamber. At her side strode Lord Cale Evergrave, a looming figure covered in pock-marked, insect-ravaged skin. Chitinous plates gleamed on his exposed arms, and his breath emitted a faint, buzzing hum. Together they exuded the decay of death incarnate. Next came Lord Cale Umbrathorn of the northern region, his translucent, blood-threaded skin glistening unnaturally under the light. Crimson veins pulsed beneath the surface, betraying the power surging within him. His steps were eerily fluid, as though his body was entirely malleable. Behind him, Saria Blackthorn, with her feral amber eyes and jagged fangs, moved like a predator stalking unseen prey. Her long, claw-like nails gleamed with a dark metallic sheen, betraying their deadly purpose. The chamber darkened as Lord Draven Nightriver entered, his grotesque form drawing gasps of awe and revulsion. Leathery wings folded awkwardly against his hunched back, and his limbs, twisted and elongated, ended in talons that clicked against the floor. Beside him, Lyra Fangspire seemed almost ethereal, her flowing white hair shimmering like moonlight. Yet her skin was alive with shifting patterns, creating the illusion of faces screaming silently beneath the surface. Lady Callista Veilthorn followed, her translucent form giving her the appearance of a wraith. Her presence brought an icy chill, and her glowing violet eyes flickered like dying embers. At her side was Arender Gravesoul, a figure who flickered in and out of visibility, his shadow-like body blending seamlessly into the darkened room. The remaining arch-vampires entered in quick succession, each accompanied by a regional head. One with scales and reptilian features, his forked tongue flicking as he surveyed the room. Another whose hair was like strands of fire, her eyes burning with an inner flame. A grotesque figure of stitched flesh, with multiple mouths and eyes scattered across his malformed body. A slender, almost human-looking vampire with metallic skin that gleamed like polished silver. Each arrival was met with nods of respect from Valerius and the gathered collective heads, though the undercurrents of rivalry and distrust were palpable. The collective's heads. Seated beside Valerius were the heads of the Nightshade Collective, each a symbol of the mansion's unyielding grip. Lord Malric, his piercing, ice-blue eyes glinting with a cool intelligence, surveyed the visitors with a faint smirk. Lady Alara Nightvale, her presence enigmatic, cloaked in shadows that seemed to whisper faintly in her wake. Her delicate features belied the cold, calculating mind behind them. Ephraim Calder, his robust figure and scarred face exuding the savagery of countless battles. He sat motionless, his crimson irises glowing faintly. Cryos Valamir, his skin almost porcelain-like in its perfection, contrasted starkly with the jagged, onyx-like claws tipping his fingers. He exuded an aura of restrained violence. Saria Duskthorn, whose dark robe shimmered faintly as though alive with faint, thorn-like protrusions. Her smile was sharp and predatory. Draven Blackspire, a hulking figure with an almost brutish air, his knotted muscles and sharp teeth hinting at his brutal efficiency. Leora Vane, with her elegant, statuesque form, carried an aura of regal menace. Her ruby-red lips curled into a faint smile as her eyes met those of each visitor in turn. Once all were seated, Valerius rose. The flickering lights dimmed as his shadow tendrils extended, their movements mesmerizing. His voice was calm yet commanding. "We are gathered here in unity as stewards of a new age," he began, his words sinking into the silence. "Tonight we discuss the growing resistance, the decline of resources, and the adjustments needed to secure our future." The room's temperature seemed to drop as the weight of his words settled. The arch-vampires exchanged subtle glances, their rivalries momentarily set aside in light of the growing threat. In the far corner, Jake, Luke, and a small group of slaves stood silently, their presence unacknowledged but their every movement observed. Luke's eyes flickered to the shadows surrounding Valerius, a faint flicker of unease and perhaps hope stirring within him. As the introductions concluded, and Valerius's shadowy aura grew heavier, it was clear this was not merely a meeting of minds, but a gathering of predators readying for war. Valerius broke the silence. "You have traveled far. Let us begin." The discussion began with reports of ferals, the scourge of Vampiakund. Saria Duskthorn stood, her voice cold and methodical. "They are spreading faster than we anticipated. In the last month alone, 3 cities under our governance have reported outbreaks. Small, contained for now, but their numbers grow. If humans continue to dwindle, we risk." She hesitated, her pride unable to utter the word. "Starvation," finished Cryos Valamir bluntly, his armored gauntlet tapping rhythmically on the table. A ripple of discontent swept through the room. "These ferals," scoffed one of the visiting arch-vampires, his voice dry and rasping. "They are merely the refuse of our kind. Call them, burn their nests to ash." "Would that it were so simple," replied Lady Alara Nightvale. "The ferals are not an isolated plague. They are a consequence of our reliance on human blood and our inability to adapt." She shot a pointed look across the table at one of the visiting heads. Lord Malric leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with disdain. "You speak of adaptation as though we are weak. We have thrived for centuries. The humans are cattle. If the herds grow thin, we simply claim more lands. And if there are no more lands to claim," countered Alara, "humans are not breeding as they once did. Entire bloodlines have vanished since the collapse. Our dependence on them will be our undoing if we do not find alternatives." The tension thickened, silence hanging heavily in the air. Valerius's voice cut through it like a blade. "Enough." All eyes turned to him. "The ferals are a symptom, not the disease," he said, his voice a measured cadence of authority. "We will cull them, yes, but we will also address the root of the issue. New resources must be cultivated, or new methods explored." A murmur swept through the gathered vampires, their discomfort palpable. Luke lingered in the shadows of the adjoining hallway, a tray of goblets balanced in his trembling hands. He had been tasked with delivering refreshments to the gathering, though none of the vampires acknowledged his presence. He moved silently, ensuring not a drop of the chilled, dark liquid blood harvested from the pets spilled. He caught fragments of the conversation through the heavy doors. The word feral sent a shiver down his spine. It was not a term the slaves were familiar with, but its tone carried unmistakable dread. The mention of starvation followed, and though fear churned in his chest, Luke couldn't help but feel a flicker of something else, a distant, dangerous emotion: hope. If the vampires were worried, if their control was faltering, perhaps cracks were forming in their unyielding dominance. It was a fragile thread, one he dared not pull, yet it lingered, a faint light in the suffocating darkness. As the gathered arch-vampires began their deliberations for the coming days, the undercurrent of tension grew more palpable. Behind their composed facades, each plotted their next move, alliances forming and dissolving in the span of moments. Valerius watched them in silence, his crimson gaze unreadable. He could feel the fractures within his own collective, the simmering ambition of the visiting arch-vampires, and the looming shadow of something far worse. The chamber remained heavy with tension, the discussions turning darker as the vampires debated their escalating problems. The ferals were a scourge, but the arch-vampires knew they were only one of many threats clawing at their supremacy. Valerius Duskborn sat at the head of the table, his posture calm but his crimson eyes sharp as blades. He raised a pale hand, silencing the murmurs. "There is another matter to discuss, one that may concern us even more than the ferals." The assembled vampires stilled. Lady Alara Nightvale, her tone as smooth and deadly as silk, took over. "Reports have surfaced from the western regions. Humans, using magic. They have begun slaughtering our kind. In isolated skirmishes, entire covens have been annihilated." The room erupted in low, guttural growls. A muscular vampire to Valerius's left slammed his fist on the table, cracking the polished obsidian. "Impossible! No human could wield such power. They are prey. This is some illusion or the work of a rogue vampire." "No illusion," Allah replied coldly. "The humans have found a way. They have formed pacts. Pacts with whom? Demons." The word hung in the air like a poison. "Demonic contracts," Alara continued, her voice steady but her expression laced with disdain. "Humans have begun forging contracts with infernal entities. They do not sell their souls, as legend would have us believe. Instead, these demons attach themselves to their hosts, feeding on their emotions, anger, desperation, ambition, consuming them from within." A sneer curled across Cryos Valamir's lips. "Fools. They think they command the demons?" Alara nodded. "Precisely. The humans believe they are in control. The demons grant them extraordinary power, enough to kill us. And while the humans use this power, the demons feed, growing stronger. When the human becomes a husk of their former self, they are devoured by their own ambition. Another arch-vampire, a wiry figure cloaked in black, hissed, "Why should we fear such creatures? They are transient at best." Ilara's gaze sharpened. "Transient, yes, but effective. These humans wield dark magic they should never have been able to touch. Blades that burn our flesh on contact. Fire that sears our immortal bodies. Entire legions of our kind have been lost in regions where these humans have risen. This is no isolated threat." The table fell into uneasy silence until a voice rang out, sharp and mocking. "Fear? Is this what we have been reduced to?" The words came from arch-vampire Tiberius Vorthin, one of the visiting lords. His voice was a snarl, his tone dripping with contempt. "Do we cower like mortals before a handful of humans playing with forces they cannot control? If you are so frightened, perhaps you are unfit to lead." The room stiffened. Tiberius's companion, a hulking vampire with eyes like molten gold, shifted uneasily. Even he could see the line his lord was crossing. Valerius's gaze flicked to Tiberius, cold as winter's edge. "You question my resolve, Tiberius?" Tiberius rose from his seat, his crimson cloak billowing. "I question your inaction. You sit here debating while the humans grow bolder, while your own covens fall. Perhaps it is time for new leadership. Leadership that understands strength is the only language these creatures comprehend." The room erupted in snarls and growls. Several vampires stood, their hands twitching toward the hilts of their katanas. But Valerius raised a hand, silencing them with a gesture. "You wish to see strength, Tiberius?" Valerius's voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried an undeniable weight. "Very well." Before Tiberius could react, shadows surged from the floor, black tendrils twisting around his limbs like living chains. They dragged him forward, forcing him to his knees before the table. "What is this?" Tiberius roared, struggling against the shadows. Valerius stood, his presence towering. He extended a single hand, and the shadows tightened, constricting Tiberius's movements until he was frozen in place. "You spoke of strength," Valerius said, his tone calm but icy. "Allow me to demonstrate." He raised his other hand, and the air in the room grew colder, suffused with an ancient, malevolent energy. Slowly, deliberately, Valerius began to strip the flesh from Tiberius's body. It started at his hands. The skin peeled back in thin, delicate ribbons, revealing the red muscle beneath. Tiberius screamed, a sound that echoed through the chamber, raw and primal. The process was excruciatingly slow, Valerius savoring every moment. Layer by layer, the flesh was removed, his arms, his chest, his face, until only a grotesque skeleton remained, glistening with blood. The room was silent, save for Tiberius's agonized moans. Valerius stepped closer, his shadowy aura almost suffocating. "Let this serve as a reminder," he said, his voice low and deadly. "Leadership is not a right. It is a burden, and it is not questioned without consequence." With a final gesture, the shadows consumed what remained of Tiberius, leaving only a faint scorch mark on the floor. Valerius returned to his seat, his expression serene, as though nothing had happened. "Now," he said, addressing the room, "shall we continue our discussion?" The remaining vampires nodded in grim silence. As Luke listened from the shadows beyond the door, he felt the last embers of hope within him waver. These creatures were not just monsters. They were gods among predators, merciless, calculating, and impossibly powerful. But even gods, he reminded himself, could fall. The chamber hummed with an uneasy energy as Valerius Duskborn addressed the assembly, his shadowed presence commanding silence. Each word he spoke seemed to ripple through the gathered arch-vampires and their advisors, resonating like a thunderclap in the vaulted hall. "We are beset by challenges," Valerius began, his voice deep and deliberate, both from within and without. "The ferals spread like a plague in our cities, a reminder of the consequences of dwindling human stock. And now the resistance grows bold, striking in ways we can no longer dismiss as mere nuisance." Ephraim Calder, Keeper of Fangs, rose from his seat. His pale, gaunt face twisted in displeasure as he unrolled a map of the surrounding regions. "Reports confirm that feral infestations are increasing near major cities. We've identified at least 3 human resistance camps in the west, heavily fortified and with growing support. Scouts indicate they're using their accursed packs to cut through our sentries. He jabbed a skeletal finger at a cluster of red-marked areas on the map. They will fall, growled Draven Blackspire, his hulking figure looming over the table. Send me and my forces. I will drag them from their hovels and feast on their despair. You underestimate them, Lady Alara Nightvale countered, her serpentine tone cutting through his bravado. These humans are no longer the fractured prey we once hunted. Their demonic allies have made them something formidable. Murmurs rippled across the table. Valerius raised a hand, silencing the room. Formidable, yes, but they remain mortal, flesh and blood. If their resistance persists, we will crush them. However, we cannot do so blindly. I will dispatch reconnaissance teams to gather intelligence on their camps. Only once we understand their weaknesses will we strike. A low hiss of approval swept through the room. It was Saria Duskthorn, the thin and angular head of the mansion's resource management, who next spoke. Her voice was sharp, her words measured. We have another matter to consider, my lord. The scarcity of human stock is at the root of all our problems. If we do not act now, we risk an even greater calamity. Your solution? Valerius asked, his tone neutral but laced with authority. Blood farms, Soria replied, leaning forward. Enclose a manageable population of humans, breed them, and harvest their blood systematically. We could sustain ourselves indefinitely without risking the collapse of our supply. The room erupted in a cacophony of voices, reducing us to cattle farmers. Cryos Valamir sneered. Pathetic. It is practical, Draven said with a shrug. We need stability. Desperate humans breed desperate measures. If a few confined humans can bring balance, so be it. Lady Alara raised an eyebrow, her expression neutral but her eyes betraying curiosity. And what of the cost? Humans, bred in captivity, may lose the essence that makes their blood so delectable. The risk outweighs the reward. Valerius let the argument play out, his eyes narrowing as he observed the factions forming within his council. Finally he stood, shadows pooling at his feet. The room fell silent again. Blood farms may be a solution, Valerius said slowly, but they are not the solution. For now, we will focus on securing our existing resources and thinning the resistance. Discuss your proposals further and bring me a plan that does not risk the dignity of our kind. The decision was final. Saria inclined her head, though the tightening of her jaw betrayed her discontent. As the meeting adjourned, the council members began to file out toward the feast hall. Among the last to leave were to visiting arch-vampire Tiberius Vorthin and Morgan Salith. Tiberius leaned close to Morgan, his voice a venomous whisper. Duskborn grows weak. He dithers while humans encroach on our lands. Morgan's skeletal grin widened. The cracks are forming. His council is divided. Perhaps it's time to remind him that even arch-vampires can fall. Tiberius's lips curled into a cruel smile. Agreed. If we can carve away portions of his territory, the others will follow. Soon, this mansion and his influence will crumble beneath him. The feast hall was a vision of decadence. Massive tables laden with exquisite dishes, roast venison marinated in red wine, bowls of exotic fruits glistening with syrup, and goblets of the finest blood, siphoned from pets groomed for perfection. The arch-vampires and their heads took their places, the room abuzz with conversation. Tensions lingered, but the grandeur of the feast provided a temporary reprieve. Valerius sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as he watched his guests. His mind, however, churned with thoughts of betrayal and impending war. Let them conspire, he thought. When the time comes, they will see who truly holds power. Each vampire holds their goblets in a toast to victory, though each sip seems laced with suspicion and ulterior motives. The grand hall had been transformed into an opulent spectacle of decadence and power. Massive chandeliers, their crystals glowing faintly with enchanted light, hung above a vast banquet table laden with food so rich it seemed otherworldly. Every detail, from the ornate silver goblets filled with blood wine to the shimmering gold platters stacked with exotic delicacies, spoke of the vampire's wealth and arrogance. The air was thick with tension as Luke and Jake stood along the edges of the room, part of a silent line of slaves. Their task was simple: observe and obey. They weren't alone. A dozen other slaves flanked them, their faces pale with dread. None dared to speak. The pets, 10 of them, were huddled at the center of the room, trembling under the collective gaze of the vampires. Jake's fists were clenched tightly at his sides, his knuckles white. Luke, standing next to him, felt the growing storm of anger radiating from his friend. But even Jake's usual defiance was tempered by fear as they watched the vampires begin to gather. Valerius Duskborn, the arch-vampire, sat at the head of the table. His presence was a black hole that seemed to draw all attention, his shadowy aura making even the boldest vampires glance away. Surrounding him were the heads of departments, including Lord Malric, who leaned back in his chair with an almost lazy smile, his dark eyes scanning the room with predatory amusement. The other arch-vampires took their places with a mixture of arrogance and caution. When the conversations finally died down, Valerius stood, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "My esteemed guests," he began, spreading his arms in a gesture of welcome. "Tonight, we celebrate not just power but indulgence. It is a rare occasion when we gather, and even rarer when we feast." The pets exchanged panicked glances. The word feast carried an ominous weight that made the air seem heavier. Luke could feel his heartbeat pounding in his chest, the weight of dread pressing down on him. Valerius gestured toward the pets. "You have been chosen for a special honor. Tonight you will serve not as mere ornaments, but as the main course." The room fell silent, save for the sharp intake of breath from the pets. "You will be given 10 seconds, Valerius continued, his smile widening to reveal his sharp fangs. 10 seconds to run. After that, the hunt begins." The pets froze, their expressions shifting from confusion to terror. Some began to weep openly, their bodies trembling. Others looked around, hoping for some escape route that didn't exist. "Run," Valerius commanded, his voice cold and final. For a moment, no one moved. The pets stood paralyzed, their terror rooting them to the spot. But then one bolted and the others followed, scattering in every direction. The vampires let them go, watching with the predator's patience. The 10 seconds ticked by like an eternity, each one marked by the pets' frantic footsteps. Then, like a storm breaking, the vampires moved. The pets who hesitated were the first to fall. Vampires blurred into motion with impossible speed, their forms a shadowy blur. The first pet, a young woman, didn't even have time to scream as Lord Malric appeared in front of her, his hand ripping through her chest with a sickening squelch. Blood sprayed in a fine mist, painting the air crimson. The others met similar fates. One pet was tackled by Lady Alara Nightvale, her delicate features twisted in sadistic delight as she ripped the silk from his body, exposing flesh she quickly tore into. Another was grabbed by Cryos, who drained her blood directly from a severed limb, his face a mask of cold indifference as he tossed her lifeless body aside. Luke and Jake watched in frozen horror, unable to look away. The slaves around them were pale and shaking, some clutching each other for support. Jake's jaw was clenched so tightly Luke thought he might shatter his own teeth. "Monsters," Jake whispered, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. Luke didn't respond. His stomach churned as he watched a pet who had managed to run nearly to the edge of the hall before being dragged back by one of the visiting arch-vampires. The vampire's grotesque, skeletal form moved with terrifying grace as he pinned the pet to the floor, pulling her skin away in strips as she screamed. The screams didn't last long. The vampires drank from their victims with unrestrained hunger, their fangs sinking into flesh as they consumed the blood that spilled freely from torn arteries. They didn't stop there. Organs were ripped free, limbs severed, and even bones cracked open to access the marrow within. The floor was a slick, sticky mess of blood and gore. The pets who had stayed, frozen by fear, met even more brutal ends. Valerius himself claimed one, his shadows pinning her in place as he drained her blood slowly, savoring every drop. Jake couldn't take it anymore. He turned away, his hands trembling as he fought the urge to scream. Luke reached out, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Don't," Luke whispered. "They'll kill you too." The feast continued, each vampire indulging in their own savage brutality. The pets who had tried to run were hunted down methodically, their screams echoing through the hall as they were dragged back and devoured. By the time the vampires were finished, there was nothing left of the pets but mangled, blood-soaked husks. The slaves stood in silent horror, their faces pale and eyes wide. None dared to speak, but the weight of what they had witnessed was etched into every trembling hand and tear-streaked face. Valerius stood once more, his face and hands clean despite the carnage around him. His voice was calm, almost serene. "Let this remind you," he said, his gaze sweeping across the slaves, "of your place. You serve us, and your life is a gift we may take whenever we choose." As the vampires began to leave the hall, their hunger sated, Luke and Jake remained frozen. The realization of their helplessness pressed down on them like a crushing weight. Jake's fury simmered just beneath the surface, but Luke felt something else, a spark of defiance buried deep within the suffocating despair. If they were going to survive this hell, they would have to fight. But for now, they could only stand and watch as the vampires left, their laughter echoing through the blood-stained hall. The grand hall stood silent now, the air heavy with the iron tongue of blood and death. Dim candlelight flickered over the remains of the feast-shattered bones, shredded clothing, and unrecognizable lumps of flesh littering the polished floors. Crimson streaks smeared the gilded walls, like grotesque paintings commemorating the vampire's depravity. The slaves entered in a slow, shuffling line, their faces pale and gaunt, eyes wide with suppressed terror. Luke led the way, his shoulders stiff as his boots squelched against the gore beneath them. Jake followed close behind, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The other slaves remained quiet, too frightened to even whisper. A single command echoed in their minds: clean. Luke grabbed a mop and bucket from the supply closet at the edge of the hall. The tools felt absurdly small for the monumental task ahead. Without hesitation, he bent down and began gathering pieces of what once were people. Fingers, shredded torsos, and clumps of hair Luke worked with mechanical precision, his face a mask of indifference. Jake, however, froze. He stared at the floor, his breathing shallow and quick. His eyes fixated on a severed hand, its delicate fingers still adorned with rings. His stomach churned violently. "Jake," Luke said sharply, not looking up. "Focus!" Jake's head snapped toward his friend, anger burning in his gaze. "How can you act like this is normal?" he hissed, his voice low enough not to draw the attention of the guards watching from the hall's far corners. Luke stopped, straightened, and turned toward Jake. His face was unreadable, but his voice was calm and cold. "It's not about normal. It's about surviving long enough to get out of here." Jake clenched his jaw, but nodded. He grabbed a mop and started cleaning, his movements erratic and fueled by rage. Every swipe of the mop left a streak of smeared blood, and he cursed under his breath, the stench of death overwhelming him. "Why do they even keep us alive?" Jake muttered, his voice shaking. "We're nothing but tools to them. Food, entertainment." Luke didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up a bloodied fragment of a dress and threw it into the pile forming near the center of the room, because they need us. Without humans, they starve. "Then let's starve them," Jake snapped, his anger bubbling over. He dropped the mop and turned to Luke, his voice trembling with fury. "Let's burn this whole place to the ground. Them, their pets, everything." Luke grabbed Jake's arm, his grip firm. "If you want to get yourself killed, fine. But if you're serious about taking them down, you'll stay quiet and follow my lead. We can't afford mistakes." Jake stared at Luke, his chest heaving. Finally, he nodded, though the fire in his eyes didn't dim. When the last of the blood and gore was scraped from the floor and the hall began to resemble its former opulence, the guards barked orders for the slaves to leave. But before they did, Jake leaned close to Luke, his voice low but resolute. "We have to escape, Jake said, his words laced with conviction. And we're not leaving anyone behind, not the slaves, not the pets. No one. Luke met his friend's gaze. For the first time in a long while, he saw something other than anger in Jake's eyes. He saw purpose. We will, Luke promised, his voice barely above a whisper, but we have to be smart about it. No one else dies because of us. The two exchanged a solemn nod, an unspoken pact forged amidst the remnants of carnage. As they walked back to their quarters, the scent of blood still clinging to their skin, a dangerous hope flickered between them. For the first time in years, they allowed themselves to imagine a world beyond the mansion's walls, a world where they were free. The quarters were suffocatingly silent, a stark contrast to the blood-soaked horrors they had just witnessed. Each slave sat on their cold, narrow bunks, their expressions hollow. The scent of iron and death still lingered in the air, as if it had clung to their skin like an unwelcome second layer. Jake leaned against the wall, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breathing was heavy, uneven, and filled with rage he could no longer contain. "I can't," he started, his voice trembling, but Luke placed a hand on his shoulder, silencing him with a firm, steady gaze. "Not yet," Luke murmured. His tone was quiet but carried the weight of authority. "Wait until the vampires are gone." The heavy iron door creaked open, and a group of guards stomped through, their eyes scanning the room. The slaves stiffened, their gazes glued to the floor, their bodies tense with fear. The guards exchanged a few muttered words before departing, their footsteps fading into the corridor. When the silence returned, Luke stood, his movements deliberate. He looked around the room, his gaze meeting each pair of frightened eyes. He saw the fear, the hopelessness, and the lingering shock of what they had just endured. But beneath it all, he saw something else. A flicker of resentment, a small ember waiting to be stoked into a flame. "This isn't living," Luke began, his voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. He stepped into the center of the room, commanding their attention. "What we saw tonight, it's just a reminder of what we all already know. None of us are getting out of here alive." Some slaves turned their heads away, unwilling or unable to meet his gaze. Others leaned forward, drawn to the raw truth in his words. "You have three choices," Luke continued, his tone sharp, almost brutal. "You can stay here, keep your heads down, and pray the vampires find you useful for a little while longer before they rip you apart." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Or you can screw up, get caught, and die screaming in the torture chambers." Jake stepped forward, his face still pale from the night's events, but his anger burned brighter now. "Or," he growled, "you can fight. Fight to get out of this hell. Fight to take back what they've stolen from us." There was a sharp laugh from the far corner of the room. Michael, one of the senior slaves, leaned back against the wall, his arms crossed and a smirk on his face. "You're both insane," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can take on them? You saw what they did tonight. We're nothing but cattle to them. They'll crush you like bugs." Luke's eyes hardened as he turned to Michael. "You're right," he said coldly. "We are nothing to them. But that's why we have to fight. They think we're weak, that we'll just lie down and take it. And most of us have, but I won't. Not anymore." Michael sneered. "And you think dragging the rest of us into your little suicide mission is noble? You'll just get us all killed faster." Jake took a step toward Michael, his fists clenched. "You'd rather sit here and wait to die?" he snapped. "At least we're trying to do something." Michael stood, his posture defiant. "Some of us aren't as eager to throw our lives away," he shot back. "You're not a hero, Jake. You're just a fool who can't see how pointless this is." "Enough," Luke said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He turned to address the rest of the room, his gaze steady. "I'm not asking anyone to come with us. This isn't a demand, it's a choice. But for those of you who've had enough of this, who'd rather die fighting than live another day like this, then help us." From the center of the room, Elias shifted uncomfortably, his skeptical expression clear. "And what's the plan exactly?" he asked, his tone cautious. You've got some grand escape idea, or are you just winging it? Luke hesitated, meeting Ilias's sharp gaze. We're working on it, he admitted. But we'll need all the help we can get. Information, supplies, distractions, whatever you can provide. We'll take it from there. Elias nodded slowly, his skepticism not entirely gone but softened by something else, curiosity, or maybe even hope. I'm not saying I'm in, he said, crossing his arms, but I'll hear you out. Luke knew this wasn't what Elias agreed to, but hopefully that speech changed his perspective. Telling Elias about bringing the pets, now that will be a challenge. Another murmur spread through the room, this time less fearful and more contemplative. A few slaves nodded, their faces set with determination. Others remained silent, their fear too great to overcome. Michael, however, wasn't finished. You're going to get everyone killed, he said, his voice loud and defiant. And when it happens, their blood will be on your hands. Luke turned to him, his expression calm but unyielding. Maybe it will, he said quietly. But at least I'll know I tried. What about you, Michael? Can you live with yourself, knowing you never even tried to fight back? Michael opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. He glared at Luke, then turned his back to the rest of the slaves. Not a word coming out of his mouth. Jake exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. That went well, he muttered, his sarcasm barely masking his frustration. For those of you who are with us, Luke said, ignoring Jake's comment, we'll meet tomorrow night. Same time. If you've got information, share it. If you've got supplies, bring them. We're not just surviving anymore. We're fighting back. As the group dispersed to their bunks, Luke sat down next to Jake, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Do you think it's enough? Jake asked, his voice low. It has to be, Luke replied. He glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on Elias, who sat on his bunk with a pensive expression. Not everyone was ready, but those who were, they might just have a chance. And for the first time in years, the suffocating air of the slaves' quarters felt just a little lighter and filled with not only hope, but determination. The cell was unnervingly silent, a rare occurrence in the slaves' quarters. The dim torchlight flickered across stone walls, casting distorted shadows on faces that were gaunt with exhaustion and fear. Maria stood in the middle of the room, her shoulders squared despite the weight of her words. The pets, most of them barely more than shadows of themselves, sat clustered around her. Their hollow eyes reflected her, but Maria's voice carried a fire that none of them had felt in years. Listen to me, she began, her tone commanding and fierce, unlike the timid obedience they'd been forced to adopt. You've heard the rumors, haven't you? Whispers of escape? I need you to understand something. This isn't just about getting out of here. This is about taking back what they stole from us. Our lives, our dignity, our souls. Several pets glanced at one another nervously, their eyes darting to the single iron door that kept them trapped. Maria continued, pacing now, her words laced with urgency. I know what you're thinking. We're just pets. We're weaker, smaller, less useful than the slaves. But I'll tell you this. Without you, there's no escape. You think the slaves can do this alone? They can't. They need us, and we need them. A murmur rippled through the group, hesitant but undeniable. Maria stopped pacing and turned to face them fully. I won't lie to you, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Most of us won't make it. Some of us will die before we even get out of the mansion. But let me ask you this. Would you rather die fighting for your freedom, or live the rest of your days waiting for them to bleed you dry? A younger pet, barely more than a girl, wiped at her tear-streaked face. But what if we fail? She whispered. Then we fail together, Maria said, her voice firm. But at least we'll know we tried. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, one by one, the pets began to nod. Their fear hadn't disappeared, but Maria's words had ignited a spark in their hearts, one they hadn't felt in years. Elias adjusted the straps of the blood bag wheelbarrow, his shoulders tense as he followed Michael down the dimly lit corridor. The mansion above was oppressive, but this was something else entirely. The air grew colder the farther they descended, the stone walls slick with moisture and stained a deep, ominous red. "Charming place," Michael muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He didn't even bother hiding his disgust as the scent of rot hit them, thick and nauseating. Elias glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. "How can you be so casual about this?" "Because," Michael said with a smirk, "it's either laugh or puke. And I'd rather not give them the satisfaction." The staircase finally ended, opening into a cavernous underground chamber. The air here was different heavy with the iron tong of blood and the faint, unmistakable sound of growls. The flickering firelight illuminated the walls, revealing deep gouges carved into the stone. Elias stopped, his breath catching as he noticed the sheer number of scratches, as though something had spent years trying to claw its way out. "Looks like someone had a bad day," Michael said, pushing the wheelbarrow forward. Elias ignored him, his attention drawn to the cages that lined the walls. Inside the first one was a creature that barely resembled a vampire. Its skin hung from its bones in shredded patches, exposing raw, glistening muscle beneath. Its eyes, bright red and filled with unrelenting hunger, snapped to Elias as he passed. The feral threw itself against the bars, its jagged teeth snapping wildly. Elias stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Don't let them scare you," Michael said, his tone dismissive. "They're just animals. Mindless, starving animals." Elias swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the creature as it snarled and lunged again. "This is what happens when vampires don't feed?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded. "Yeah, they go feral. No thoughts, no plans, just hunger. If they didn't cage them up, they'd tear through this place like a plague." The pair continued down the row, the ferals growing more agitated with every step. One had lost its lower jaw, but that didn't stop it from snapping wildly at the air. Another was so emaciated that its ribs jutted out like knives, yet its strength was evident in the way it bent the iron bars of its cage. Elias forced himself to breathe, the sight of these creatures rattling him more than he cared to admit. "Why don't they just kill them?" he asked. Michael shrugged. "Maybe they're saving them for something. Or maybe they just like knowing they're down here, suffering." As they approached the final cage, Elias hesitated. This feral was different, larger, more grotesque. Its limbs were elongated, its fingers ending in claws that scraped against the floor. Its eyes locked onto Elias, and for a moment he swore it smiled. He turned to Michael, desperate for distraction. "Why do you suck up to the vampires?" Michael's smirk faltered, his usual bravado slipping. "What's it to you?" "Because it's pathetic," Elias said, his frustration boiling over. "You act like they're your friends, but they'll kill you just like the rest of us." Single quotes. Michael's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Then tell me," Elias pressed. "Why do you act like this?" Michael was silent for a long moment. Finally he spoke, his voice low and bitter. "Because I've seen what happens when you don't. My sister, they took her, made her a pet. I thought I could protect her if I stayed useful, but it didn't matter. They played their games with her anyway." Elias stared at him, his anger softening into pity. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Don't be," Michael snapped. "It won't bring her back." They finished their task in silence, the growls of the ferals echoing in their ears. Later that night, Elias found Luke preparing food for himself and the slaves, the one thing bringing us together. A semi-decent meal together. The firelight cast long shadows across his face, making him look older than his years. "Luke," Elias said, his voice urgent. Luke looked up, his expression weary. "What is it?" Elias quickly described the feral prison, the blood-soaked walls, the lack of guards, the terrifying creatures. "It's a weak point," he concluded. "If we can figure out how to use it, we might have a chance. Luke's brow furrowed as he considered this. "It's risky," he said finally, "but it might be our only shot." Elias nodded. "Then let's make it count. Looks like I will have to give Lord Malric another visit." The tension in the air was palpable as Luke followed the iron-laced corridors toward Lord Malric's quarters. Each step he took echoed ominously against the cold stone walls, the weight of his plan pressing down on him. He had rehearsed his request in his head countless times, yet the prospect of facing Lord Malric directly felt akin to walking unarmed into a lion's den. The Keeper of Fangs was known for his ruthlessness, but also his peculiar sense of intrigue. While others saw Luke's defiance as insolence, Malric had seemed amused by it during their past encounters, an amusement that bordered on dangerous curiosity. Luke paused outside the ornate doors leading to Malric's chambers. The air smelled faintly of blood and decaying roses, an unnerving yet fitting combination. Steeling himself, he pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside. Lord Malric sat in a high-backed chair carved from dark ebony, the intricate designs resembling the twisting forms of writhing souls. Behind him, the vast room was bathed in a muted crimson glow, the light emanating from lanterns filled with some unnatural fire. He didn't look up immediately, instead thumbing lazily through a thick book bound in human skin. His appearance was as unsettling as ever, his sharp features too perfect to be human, his skin pale enough to reflect the dim light. Malric's eyes, a piercing silver that seemed to see too much, finally met Luke's. "Well, well," Malric drawled, his voice smooth and laced with mockery. "The bold one returns. What brings you to my den, little lamb?" Luke clenched his fists at the condescension but kept his tone steady. "I need access to the feral prison." The room fell deathly silent, save for the faint crackle of the lantern flames. Malric arched an elegant brow, closing his book with a deliberate thud. "You need access to the feral prison," he repeated slowly, as though savoring the audacity of the request. "Yes," Luke said firmly. "I need the keys. Have a plan." Malric rose from his chair in a fluid motion, towering over Luke as he approached. There was an intensity to his gaze that made Luke's stomach churn, but he refused to look away. Malric circled him like a predator assessing its prey, his steps silent on the polished marble floor. "And what, pray tell, is this plan?" Malric asked, his tone dripping with amusement. Luke hesitated. "With respect, my lord, I'd prefer not to share the details. Not yet." Malric stopped abruptly, his silver eyes narrowing. For a moment, Luke feared he had overstepped. Then, to his astonishment, Malric laughed, a low, melodic sound that sent shivers down Luke's spine. "Bold. Very bold," Malric murmured, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I must admit, your defiance intrigues me. Most slaves would be groveling on the floor by now." "I'm not like most slaves," Luke replied, the words escaping before he could stop them. Malric's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, you're not. And that's precisely why I'll entertain your request." Luke blinked in surprise. "You will?" "Yes," Malric said, returning to his chair and lounging as though this were all a game to him. "But on one condition." Luke's throat tightened. "What condition?" Malric's expression turned inscrutable, his silver eyes gleaming with an emotion Luke couldn't decipher. "You'll find out soon enough, if your plan succeeds." Luke left Malric's quarters with the weight of the keys in his pocket, an annoying sense of unease in his chest. Malric's cryptic words replayed in his mind, each syllable dripping with hidden menace. He had agreed too icily, and Luke couldn't shake the feeling that the price for his freedom would be far greater than he anticipated. As he walked through the dimly lit corridors, his thoughts returned to the feast. The blood, the screams, the grotesque glee with which the vampires had torn through the pets. He had forced himself to remain still, to swallow his revulsion, to be a silent observer while innocents were slaughtered. But now, in the quiet of the empty halls, the images clawed at his mind, the ripping of flesh, the lifeless eyes of those pets, once so full of fear and desperate hope. Luke's hands trembled, his nails digging into his palms. He hated himself for not acting, for not doing anything to stop it. But what could he have done? Even now, the memory of the vampire's speed and power made his stomach churn. His hatred for them burned brighter than ever, but beneath it was a flicker of disgust at himself. He had stood there and done nothing. When Luke returned to the slave quarters, Jake and Elias were waiting anxiously. The room was dimly lit, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the rough stone walls. "You got them?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Luke nodded and pulled the keys from his pocket. The metal gleamed faintly in the dim light, a symbol of both hope and impending danger. Elias stared at the keys as though they were a death sentence. "I can't believe you went to him directly. Are you insane?" "Probably," Luke admitted, "but we don't have a choice. This is our best shot." Jake clapped a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "You did good. Now we just have to make it count." Back in his chambers, Malric stood by the window overlooking the sprawling estate. He held a glass of blood-red wine, the liquid swirling lazily as he stared into the darkness beyond. He had known slaves like Luke before, defiant, ambitious, and far too human for their own good. Most were crushed beneath the weight of their own rebellion, their spirits shattered long before their bodies followed. But Luke was different. There was a fire in his eyes that Malric hadn't seen in centuries, a determination that reminded him of. He shook the thought away and took a sip of his wine, the bitterness grounding him. The memory of the feast clawed at him, unbidden. The rush of blood, the shattering of bones, the screams. He had watched it all with a mask of indifference. Yet something about it had left him hollow. He had played his role as the keeper of fangs, a being of power and fear. But now, in the silence of his chambers, the aftermath lingered. For the first time in centuries, he felt something close to disgust. "Freedom," he murmured to himself, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. Such a fragile thing. "Let's see how far you're willing to go to grasp it, little lamb." As the crimson moon hung high in the sky, Malric smiled faintly, the first genuine smile he'd allowed himself in years. For the first time in decades, he was curious to see what would happen next. The morning light barely reached the lower corridors of the mansion. Even with torches mounted on the walls, their flames dancing and flickering, the space felt suffocating, heavy with the stench of blood and despair. Michael moved through the dim halls, barking orders at the slaves as they scrubbed floors and polished furniture. His voice cut through the silence like a whip, sharp and commanding. "Keep moving, you lazy wretches! I want to see my reflection in that floor, or you'll regret it." He snarled at one particularly slow worker. Yet, even as he barked commands, his mind wandered back to his conversation with Elias the day before. His words lingered like a poison in his thoughts. "Why are you like this, Michael? Why do you take their side?" Michael clenched his jaw, trying to shake the memory, but it clung to him like a curse. "Why am I like this?" The answer came unbidden, sharp and cruel. His sister's face, pale and lifeless, staring up at him from a pool of her own blood. He had failed her. He had been too weak to save her. And now he punished everyone else for his own inadequacy. He pushed the thought aside, replacing it with the cold, detached efficiency he had mastered over the years. "You, they're faster! And you, stop slouching!" But no amount of shouting could drown out his thoughts. The image of his sister's death faded, replaced by something else. Elias's face, the fire in his eyes as he spoke of rebellion. Michael shook his head. Fools. All of them. They'll die like the others. Just like she did. As Michael was mentally berating himself, a vampire servant appeared at the doorway, her voice cold and clipped. The mistress summons you, Michael. Now. He felt his stomach drop. The mistress, Lady Alara Nightvale, the cruel overseer of the pets, was not someone to be kept waiting. Without a word, he followed the servant through the winding corridors of the mansion. The air grew colder as they approached her quarters, the dim light replaced by an eerie, unnatural glow. The door to her chambers loomed ahead, heavy and ornate, with intricate carvings of fangs and thorned vines. The servant knocked once before pushing it open. Inside, the room was a mix of decadence and horror. A single cage sat in the corner, its bars bent slightly out of shape, and the floor beneath it was stained with blood. The metallic scent was overwhelming, and Michael's eyes lingered on the crimson puddle. Another pet had met their end. Lady Alara stood near the cage, her pale hand idly toying with a silver whip. Her piercing gaze landed on Michael the moment he entered, and a cruel smile spread across her lips. "Michael," she said, her voice soft but laced with venom. "You're late." Michael bowed his head, his fists clenched at his sides. "My apologies, mistress. I came as soon as I was summoned." She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Enough with the groveling. I summoned you for answers. The slaves, what are they whispering about? What little schemes are they plotting now?" Michael hesitated, the words forming on his lips. He knew exactly what she wanted to hear. He had heard Luke and Jake's whispers, their plans for rebellion. He could tell her everything. He should tell her everything. But something stopped him. For the first time in years, a flicker of doubt entered his mind. He thought of Elias's words, of the fire in his eyes. He thought of Luke, defiant even in the face of despair. And he thought of himself, of the blood on his hands, of the countless slaves and pets who had been executed because of his intel. "I haven't heard anything, mistress," he said finally, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment he thought she might see through him. "Nothing?" she repeated, her voice dangerously low. "Nothing, mistress," he said again, forcing himself to meet her gaze. Her expression darkened, and before he could react, she lashed out with the silver whip, the sharp crack echoing through the room as it tore through his shirt and skin. "You think I'm a fool, Michael?" she hissed, striking him again. He staggered back, the pain searing, but he didn't cry out. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. "I'll ask you again," she said, advancing on him, her eyes blazing with fury. "What do you know?" Michael hesitated for a fraction of a second too long, and she struck him again, this time sending him crashing into the wall. The impact left him dazed, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. When he didn't respond, she kicked him, her strength far greater than any human's. The force sent him sprawling across the floor, his body screaming in agony. "You're useless," she spat, turning away from him. "Get out of my sight." Michael somehow managed to drag himself back to the slaves' quarters, his body battered and broken. The other slaves avoided his gaze, their eyes filled with a mix of fear and pity. He found Luke near the back of the chamber. For a moment Michael hesitated. He had spent years hating Luke, resenting his strength, his defiance. But now he felt something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Respect. "I need to talk to you," Michael said, his voice hoarse. Luke turned to him, his eyes narrowing as he took in Michael's bloodied appearance. "What happened?" Michael shook his head. "It doesn't matter. Just listen." He took a deep breath, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I know what you're planning. I've known for a while. And I haven't said anything." Luke stared at him, his expression unreadable. Why? Michael looked away, shame burning in his chest. Because I'm tired. Tired of being their dog. Tired of getting people killed. I've been responsible for the deaths of dozens, hundreds even, but not this time. He met Luke's gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. I don't know why I didn't say anything to her. Maybe I'm going soft. Maybe I'm finally growing a conscience. I don't know. But I'm not going to stop you. Not this time. Luke studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then help us, he said simply. Michael hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. I'll think about it, he said finally, before turning and walking away. As he left, he felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, he hadn't betrayed his own kind. For the first time, he had chosen to stand against the vampires, even if only in a small way. And for the first time, he felt hope. The air in the slave quarters was stifling, thick with sweat, fear, and the whispers of hope. Luke stood at the center of the room, the dim light of a single lantern casting shadows on his weary face. Around him the slaves formed a loose circle, their expressions a mixture of skepticism, desperation, and something Luke hadn't seen in a long time. Resolve. I won't sugarcoat this, Luke began, his voice low but firm. What we're planning, it's suicide. Most of us won't make it out alive. Hell, maybe none of us will, but staying here? You know what that means. You've seen it with your own eyes. A murmur ran through the group, the memory of the feast still fresh. The images of torn flesh, the screams of the pets, Andre replayed in their minds like a nightmare they couldn't wake from. We've all heard the same thing, Luke continued. Work until you're too broken to be of use, then die. Or maybe you piss off the wrong vampire and they decide to make an example of you. Either way, we're nothing to them. Less than nothing. He paused, meeting their eyes one by one. But we can change that. We can fight. And maybe, just maybe, we can live. Jake stepped forward, his fists clenched. They'll never see it coming. They think we're weak, helpless. They think we'll just lie down and die when they tell us to. His voice rose, fueled by his hatred. Let's prove them wrong. The slaves murmured again, this time louder, their fear tempered by anger. Luke took a deep breath. Here's the plan. He laid it out step by step, his voice steady even as the enormity of what they were about to do weighed on him. Luke's role. I have the keys to the feral prison. I'll unlock the gates and toss blood bags to distract them. If I survive long enough, the ferals will do the rest. A ripple of unease passed through the group. Everyone knew what ferals were capable of. Jake's task. Jake will place blood bags in the vampires' quarters. It's a risk, but with the constant scent of blood in this place, they might not think twice about it. If it works, it'll drive the ferals straight to them. Jake smirked, his confidence masking the terror that churned in his gut. Elias's mission. Elias will set fire to the east wing near the arch-vampire's chambers. It'll create chaos and draw their attention away from the rest of the mansion. Elias nodded, his face pale but determined. Michael's role. Michael will mislead them. He'll report that we're planning to raid the armory and make a break for the front gates. It's risky, but it'll divert their focus long enough for us to escape. Michael flinched at the mention of his name. His recent change of heart still felt foreign, and the weight of his past betrayals pressed heavily on his shoulders. The pets. The pets will gather supplies, food, clothing, anything we can carry. We'll need it if we make it out. Luke's gaze swept over the group, and when the mansion is in chaos, we'll head for the underground tunnels. If Michael's right, they'll lead us to freedom. If he's wrong. He trailed off, letting the unspoken end hang in the air. For a moment, silence reigned. Then a voice broke it. This is madness, a man muttered. Luke turned to see Michael, his face a mask of doubt. You're putting all your faith in luck and ferals? You think that'll save us? No, Luke replied evenly. But it's better than waiting here to die. Michael opened his mouth to argue, but stopped. His own words from earlier echoed in his mind. I don't know why I lied to her. Before he could speak again, another voice piped up. I'm in, Elias said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. One by one the others began to nod, but not everyone. A handful of slaves shook their heads, their fear outweighing their hope. You'll get us all killed, one of them whispered. Then stay here, Jake snapped. Be their cattle. See how long that lasts. Luke raised a hand, silencing the argument. This is voluntary, no one's forcing you. But for those of us who are in, we move tomorrow night. The group dispersed, whispers filling the room. Luke stood still, staring at the ground. You think this'll work? Jake asked quietly, coming to stand beside him. No, Luke admitted. But it's all we've got. The dimly lit supply room was cramped and smelled of dust and mold. Old crates lined the walls, their lids warped from years of neglect. Inside there were scraps of fabric, discarded blankets, and, if they were lucky, dried rations. A pet near the corner sniffled, clutching a strip of cloth to her chest. We're going to die for this, aren't we? She whispered. Maria crouched down beside her, her eyes fierce. We're going to die if we don't do this. It's not a choice anymore. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a shroud. Maria straightened, her voice firm as she addressed them all. They've taken everything from us. Our dignity, our freedom, our names. It's time we take something back. One by one the pets nodded. The fear remained, but beneath it was a flicker of determination. They worked quickly, stuffing whatever they could find into stolen satchels. A few stale loaves of bread, half a sack of grain, even some frayed rope, all of it could mean the difference between survival and death. Maria kept watch as the others moved silently, her mind racing. The success of their plan hinged on every second they could buy. If the vampires discovered their efforts too soon, none of them would live to see the morning. As they left the supply room, Maria cast one last glance over her shoulder, her heart pounding. If they were caught, there would be no mercy. Michael's feet dragged as he ascended the stone staircase leading to the female vampire's chambers. His stomach churned with a mix of fear and self-loathing. The door loomed ahead, black and imposing, with intricate carvings that seemed to writhe under the flickering torchlight. He hesitated for a moment, then knocked. Enter, came the cold, clipped voice from within. He stepped inside, bowing his head instinctively. The room was sparsely furnished, save for a massive iron chair in the center, its edges sharp and cruel. The female vampire sat there, her pale fingers drumming against the armrest. Report, she said, her crimson eyes narrowing as they fixed on him. Michael swallowed hard. I've heard whispers, my lady. A group of slaves is planning an escape. Her eyes gleamed with interest, but her expression remained cold. Continue. They're planning to raid the armory, Michael said, forcing his voice to remain steady. They believe they can arm themselves and fight their way out through the front gates. The vampire leaned forward, her gaze piercing. And you're certain of this? Yes, my lady, Michael lied, his palms slick with sweat. For a moment she said nothing, her eyes searching his face as if peeling back the layers of his mind. Then, with a dismissive wave of her hand, she leaned back. Fools, let them try. It will be their last mistake. Michael nodded, bowing low. Of course, my lady. As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him cold. Michael. He froze. Yes, my lady. Don't disappoint me. The threat hung heavy in the air as he exited the room, his heart pounding like a war drum. Back in the slave quarters, the atmosphere was grim. Luke and Jake had assembled the others, explaining the plan in hushed tones. You want us to what? A young slave asked, his voice shaking. Luke stepped forward, his face impassive. We need blood bags to lure the ferals. The vampires can't know we've taken from their supply, so it has to come from us. Murmurs rippled through the group, a mix of disbelief and fear. Jake's voice cut through the noise. "You've all seen what they do to us, to the pets. Are you really going to sit here and wait for your turn to die?" The room fell silent. One by one, the slaves stepped forward, baring their arms as Luke and Jake prepared crude syringes made from scavenged supplies. The process was slow and excruciating. Blood dripped into the bags, each drop a testament to their desperation. The slaves grew paler with each donation, their bodies trembling with weakness. Jake clenched his fists, his jaw tight as he watched. "We're going to make this worth it," he muttered under his breath. The blood bags were heavy in Jake's arms as he made his way through the mansion's labyrinthine hallways. His steps were deliberate, his expression neutral, but his heart raced with every passing guard. Jake had to be fast before the blood coagulated too much within the bags. "Delivery for the quarters," he said when questioned, keeping his voice steady. The guards barely glanced at him, their disinterest a small blessing. When he reached the vampire's quarters, the air was thick with the oppressive scent of decay and power. Jake set the bags down carefully, making sure to place them out of sight but in strategic locations where the scent would linger. Behind a thick velvet curtain, under the edge of a plush chaise lounge, and near the foot of an ornate, towering bed, each spot was chosen with care, designed to delay discovery until the scent of blood was undeniable. Using a small, concealed knife, he punctured each bag just enough for the blood to seep out slowly. The rich, coppery scent filled the air almost immediately, mixing with the room's faint traces of perfume and decay. He wiped his hands on his trousers, his heart hammering in his chest as he surveyed his work. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of a guard lingering nearby, his eyes narrowing slightly. Jake forced himself to walk away calmly, resisting the urge to run. Only when he was back in the relative safety of the slave quarters did he allow himself to breathe. "We're one step closer," he said to Luke, his voice low but resolute. Luke nodded, his expression grim. "One step closer to freedom or death." Luke adjusted the heavy iron keyring on his belt, his heart hammering against his ribcage like a trapped animal. Each step toward the feral prison felt heavier than the last, as if the mansion itself were weighing down on him, testing his resolve. The corridors leading to the prison were quieter than usual, the dim torches casting flickering shadows across the cold stone walls. He glanced at the blood bags slung over his shoulder, their dark contents shifting with each movement. The shadows of the mansion seemed heavier that night, stretching like the claws of unseen predators. Every breath Luke took felt like inhaling ice. He stood at the entrance to the feral prison, facing a hulking vampire guard whose sharp eyes bore into him with suspicion. "You're alone?" the guard asked, narrowing his bloodshot gaze. His voice was like gravel, low and menacing. Luke forced his body to stay still. "Yes, I was told to feed them." There wasn't time to wait for a second hand. The guard tilted his head slightly, frowning. "Strange. That's against protocol." "I didn't question it," Luke replied, keeping his tone neutral. "I only follow orders. If there's an issue, you can take it up with Lord Malric." He emphasized the name, knowing it carried enough weight to dissuade further questioning. The guard hesitated, his hand gripping the heavy iron key ring at his belt. Finally, he grunted and turned, unlocking the thick iron door. "If you don't come out, I'm not going in there to save you." Luke swallowed the knot in his throat and stepped through the creaking door. The air inside was suffocating, a cocktail of rot, blood, and despair that clung to his skin. The dim torches lining the narrow corridor flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the blood-smeared walls. Ahead, the ferals stirred. As Luke walked deeper into the prison, the sounds of chains rattling and low guttural growls filled the space. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, revealing the caged horrors that lined both sides of the corridor. The ferals were skeletal, their flesh clinging to their bones as if their bodies had forgotten the luxury of sustenance. Their jagged teeth glistened, stained with dried blood. Their red eyes glowed like embers, following Luke's every move. One of them lunged against the bars, snarling viciously. The force of its attack sent sparks flying as its chains strained. Luke froze for a moment, his heart hammering in his chest. "Easy," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of hunger and rage. He reached into the sack he carried, pulling out blood bags. One by one, he hurled them to the farthest end of the corridor. The ferals reacted instantly, their attentions shifting to the scent of fresh blood. They clawed at the bars, their inhuman screeches echoing through the halls. Luke's hands trembled as he punctured the bags with a sharp nail. Blood sprayed across the stone floor, pooling and trailing toward the cages. The ferals went wild, thrashing against their confines. "Just a little longer," Luke whispered, his voice a plea as much as a reassurance, unlocking the beast. With the ferals distracted, Luke moved to the first cell. He fumbled with the iron key, his fingers slick with sweat. The lock clicked open with a groan, and the feral inside lunged, its chains barely holding it back. Luke recoiled, his stomach churning. He moved to the next cell, then the next, each lock opening with agonizing slowness. By the time he reached the final cell, a sound behind him froze him in place, the snap of breaking metal. Luke turned, his blood running cold. At the far end of the corridor, one of the ferals had broken free of its shackles. Its red eyes met his, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Then it roared, a guttural sound that shook the air. Luke didn't think. He ran. The feral gave chase, its bare feet slapping against the blood-soaked floor. Luke's legs burned as he sprinted toward the exit, the beast's growls growing louder behind him. As he reached the door, he shouted to the guards stationed outside. "One of them's loose!" The guard's eyes widened. Without hesitation, he slammed the door shut and locked it, sealing Luke on the safe side. "Stay here!" The guard barked, running off to alert reinforcements. Luke doubled over, panting. His body trembled with a mix of fear and exhilaration. Then Luke carefully unlocked the gate and ran sprinting for the others. Waiting for the ferals to leave the prison to hunt for the human blood lingering in the air. Elias crept through the mansion's east wing, his heart pounding in his ears. The oil-soaked rags he carried reeked, but their stench was nothing compared to the fear gnawing at him. He paused by a towering set of curtains, their deep crimson fabric heavy with dust. Carefully he tucked an oil-soaked rag into the folds and doused the surrounding area. The hall was eerily silent, save for the faint crackle of nearby torches. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a thunderclap in the oppressive quiet. He moved to a series of ornate paintings lining the walls. Their gilded frames depicted long-dead vampires in regal poses. Elias doused the edges of the canvas with oil, his hands shaking. Finally he pulled out the lighter. The small flame flickered, illuminating his face. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the spark wheel. "This is for all of us," he whispered. He lit the first rag. The flame caught slowly, then roared to life, licking up the curtain. Elias moved quickly, lighting more rags and tossing them onto the oil-soaked floor. The fire spread rapidly, devouring everything in its path. Smoke filled the air, stinging his eyes and lungs. As the flames climbed higher, alarms began to sound, deep, resonant gongs that echoed through the mansion. Luke, Jake, and Elias regrouped near the pets' quarters, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. The chaos inside the mansion was palpable, the sound of shouted orders, the clash of weapons, and the distant roars of ferals echoed through the halls. "Now," Luke said, his voice firm. They made their way to the pets' chambers, where a handful of guards were stationed. "There's a fire!" Luke shouted, his voice tinged with urgency. "You need to get help." The guards exchanged glances, their confusion giving way to panic. They bolted toward the source of the commotion, leaving the chambers unguarded. Luke and Jake burst into the room, where the pets huddled together, their faces pale with fear. "It's time," Luke said. "Follow us. Stay quiet, and don't look back." The pets hesitated for a moment, then rose as one, their determination outweighing their fear. The group moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The smell of smoke grew stronger, mingling with the scent of blood that seemed to permeate the very walls. As they reached the edge of the east wing, Luke glanced back. The flames had spread, casting an ominous glow that lit up the night. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "No turning back." Luke's thoughts churned with doubt as they gathered in the dimly lit chamber near the entrance to the feral prison. The air was thick with the scent of blood, smoke, and Farah's suffocating reminder of what they had done. He clutched the bundle of supplies tightly, his knuckles pale. The prison was so close, but now felt like an eternity away. Have we rushed this? The question gnawed at him, echoing in his mind as he glanced at the others. Jake was sharpening one of the makeshift wooden spikes, his jaw clenched in grim determination. Elias adjusted the strap on a bundle of blankets, his gaze darting nervously toward the flickering light of the fire spreading above them. The pets and other slaves huddled close, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear and hope. They were running on borrowed time, and worse, on sheer luck. The key in his possession had been their catalyst, but now he wondered if it had made them reckless. Could they really outrun the chaos they had unleashed? Only time would tell. They slipped into formation, the pets and slaves forming a tight group between Luke, Jake, Elias, and a handful of others armed with crude wooden spikes. Each step felt like it could be their last, the world above them a chaotic maelstrom of death and fire. The growls of ferals mixed with the metallic clang of swords and the wet, sickening sound of claws tearing into flesh. Luke stole a glance down a corridor as they moved. A feral lunged toward a group of vampires, its claws ripping through the chest of a lower-ranking guard with ease. The vampire screamed, a sound unlike anything Luke had heard before, as the feral tore through sinew and bone, blood spraying across the stone walls like a grotesque mural. Another vampire tried to intervene, his rapier slicing cleanly through the feral's arm, but it was too late. The beast turned, its jagged teeth sinking into the vampire's neck, ripping out his throat in one brutal motion. The feral dropped him like a rag doll, its glowing red eyes fixating on its next victim. Nearby, another feral dragged a vampire to the ground, its claws shredding through the fine fabric of the vampire's coat, exposing pale flesh. The vampire shrieked as the feral dug its teeth into his stomach, pulling out entrails in a horrific display. Luke pulled his gaze away, his stomach churning. He couldn't afford to freeze now. "Keep moving," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. They moved as shadows, staying low, slipping through the carnage unnoticed. Lady Alara Nightvale, her silver hair stained with blood, extended her hands toward a feral. Shadowy tendrils erupted from her fingers, wrapping around the beast and squeezing until it burst apart, a spray of blood and viscera painting the walls. The fire Elias had started was spreading rapidly. Flames climbed the walls, devouring tapestries and wooden beams. Smoke billowed through the corridors, choking the air. The vampires, preoccupied with the ferals, paid little attention to the blaze consuming their home. "Just the diversion we need," Luke thought grimly. The corridor narrowed as they moved deeper, the walls slick with condensation and the faint, cloying scent of rot. The group came to the final stretch of the prison, a row of cells stretching into the shadows. Then they heard it. A low growl echoed from the farthest cell. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight, a guttural, inhuman sound that made the hair on Luke's arms stand on end. Everyone froze. From the open cell at the end of the corridor, movement stirred. A feral, bound in heavy chains, lay slumped against the wall. But then its head jerked up, and its bloodshot eyes locked onto the group. Humans! The scent of human blood filled the air. The feral's growl deepened, turning into a wet snarl. It threw itself against the chains, its body contorting in unnatural ways. "Keep moving," Luke whispered, his voice barely audible. The feral's frenzy intensified. Pieces of its body tore free, hanging in bloody ribbons as it writhed and clawed at the air. "Gods!" Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "Shut up," Jake hissed. The feral's chains groaned, its flesh tearing further with each lunge. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood and the fetid stench of decay. Then silence. The feral froze, its eyes still fixed on them. Its breathing was ragged, each exhale a guttural rasp. Jake turned, gesturing for everyone to stay silent as they moved past the cell. Each step was agonizingly slow, the sound of their boots on stone impossibly loud in the stillness. They were almost past it. A sudden crash shattered the silence. The feral hurled itself against the bars, its body ripping free of its chains with a sickening crunch. Flesh and bone splattered across the stone. It stared at them, unhinged and ravenous. The pets gasped, their terror breaking the fragile quiet. "Run!" Luke shouted. The group bolted, the sound of the feral's snarls chasing them as they fled. The feral erupted from the shadows, its gaunt form blocking the path ahead. It sniffed the air, its sunken nostrils flaring. Then, with a low, guttural growl, it surged forward. One of the pets screamed, her grip faltering. The feral was on her before she could even cry out. Its jaws unhinged wider than seemed possible, and it sank its teeth deep into her neck. Blood sprayed in an arc, coating the feral's face as it ripped her throat out. Her lifeless eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, but the feral didn't stop. It tore her stomach open, spilling her intestines onto the floor. Luke's voice cut through the horror. "Run!" The group bolted, the sound of the feral's snarls chasing them as they fled. Luke's heart thundered in his chest. He pushed one of the pets forward. "Don't stop! Keep running!" Elias stumbled, his foot catching on uneven stone. He hit the ground hard. Luke skittered to a halt, grabbing Elias and hauling him upright. "Move!" The feral's shadow loomed on the wall behind them. They burst into a wider chamber. Jake spun around, holding his spike like a spear. "We make a stand here!" "No!" Luke hissed. "We don't stand a chance." But the group staggering to a stop behind them. The feral was still feeding, crouched over the broken body of one of the pets. It ripped her leg clean from her body with a sickening crack. The pet's body convulsed once, then fell limp. Luke took a step forward, his voice sharp. "Pikes up! Hold your ground! Don't break formation or we all die!" The feral charged. It moved with terrifying speed, a blur of rotting flesh and bone. "Brace!" Luke shouted. The moment stretched into eternity. The feral collided with the group. Elias's pike pierced its chest. "Now!" Luke roared. The group surged forward, stabbing into the feral's body, flesh tearing and bones crunching. Jake struck the killing blow, driving his spike deep into the feral's neck. It let out a final guttural growl. Slowly, its remaining eye began to dim. Luke dropped his spike, his hands trembling. "It's dead," he muttered. "It's finally dead." The survivors stared at the corpse. It lay in a mangled heap, one remaining eye staring blankly into the void. Jake spat on the corpse. Let's hope that was the last one. The group huddled around a fallen slave, his blood pooling beneath him. Elias knelt beside the man. "We can save him," Elias whispered. Luke stood back, his expression cold. "He's already gone." Luke knelt beside the dying man. "What's your name?" The man hesitated. "Ryan." Luke nodded. "Ryan, you're free. No more numbers, no more chains. I swear I'll remember you." Luke pulled a wooden spike from his belt. "I'll make it quick." He plunged the spike into Ryan's chest. Ryan's body jolted once, then stilled, his features frozen in a serene finality. The silence that followed was deafening. "This is what it takes to survive," Luke said, his voice like steel. "Every step we take, we lose more of us. But we're still here. Don't let their deaths be in vain." The tunnel narrowed into a winding path. The only sounds were the shuffle of footsteps. They passed corridor after corridor of empty cells. The stench of decay was suffocating. One of the pets gagged. Luke's sharp whisper cut through the silence. "Keep moving." The group emerged from the cavern into a large open space. The stars stretched endlessly above them. The air was crisp and cool. For the first time, hope flickered in their hearts. But as they moved toward the mouth of the cave, a figure stepped forward. Lord Malric stood before them, his sword dripping with fresh gore. A wicked smile spread across his face. "So, my little prodigy made it out alive," he said, his voice a mockery of praise. "And with slaves and pets in tow. You've exceeded my expectations, Luke." Luke's grip tightened on his spike. Malric tilted his head. "Do you remember what I told you? A toll is owed. And now I've come to collect." Luke stepped forward. "If you want a toll, Malric, you'll have to take it from me." Malric's smile widened. "Oh, I fully intend to." The chamber was deathly silent. Malric raised his gloved hand and pointed. "That one. Behind you." Luke's breath hitched as he turned. "Michael." Michael stood frozen, his face drained of all color. Michael had sold out his own kind. But now, faced with the same fate himself, he was nothing but a sniveling wreck. "No, please," Michael rasped. "I did everything you asked." Malric crouched beside him. His voice dropped to a whisper. "And yet, here we are." Michael let out a choked whimper. Malric reached for him, and that was when Luke moved. A primal scream tore from his throat as he lunged for Malric's heart. Time slowed. Then, in the space between heartbeats, Malric vanished. A split second later, a force like a battering ram struck Luke's chest. His ribs shattered. Pain, blinding, soul-ripping pain. Luke was airborne before he was hurled backward like a rag doll, his back slammed into solid stone. Sickening cracks split through the chamber. His body crumpled to the floor. Every nerve screamed. He couldn't move. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Malric's bored voice. Predictable. Luke forced his head up just in time to see Jake. Jake was shaking, his teeth bared. Malric turned toward him. "I wouldn't. Attack me and you die." Jake hesitated. Malric smiled. Luke tried to push himself up, but pain exploded through his ribs. A shadow loomed over him. Then, agony. Malric's boot crushed his hand against the stone floor. Luke's scream ripped through the chamber. The sound was raw, guttural, something torn from the depths of his soul. His fingers bent at unnatural angles, bones splintering beneath the unrelenting pressure. Malric crouched down, his fingers gripping Luke's chin. "You're brave," the vampire murmured. "But bravery without power, that's just suicide." Michael was sobbing, his entire body convulsing. Malric released Luke and turned toward the cowering traitor. "Please!" Michael begged. Malric tilted his head. "Begging. How human. Michael's lips parted. Then darkness swallowed him whole. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around his throat. Michael let out a gurgling scream as he was dragged into the black void. His nails tore off in bloody streaks. Then he was gone. Luke barely registered the hands grabbing him, dragging him away from the wreckage. His vision blurred. Malric stood tall, untouched. Like none of this had even mattered. Luke wanted to stand, wanted to fight. But the pain was too much. It dragged him under, into a void of nothingness. And then, darkness. Hello all, this is Mr. X Bickles. I hope you've enjoyed my story. I know it was slow at parts. Originally, this story wasn't meant for this format, so I had to change it slightly. For more creepy stories for those late nights and times, where an interesting story fills the silence. For now, goodbye.